It often begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible fracturing of the reality you've so carefully constructed. The life that, from the outside, looks like a finished masterpiece. You have the career, the relationships, the markers of success that society hands you on a checklist. And you've ticked every box. You have played the game. And by all accounts, you have won. But then, in the silent moments, the hum of the refrigerator at midnight, the pause between songs on your commute, a question begins to surface. A whisper from a place you didn't know existed within you. Is this all there is? This feeling is not sadness. Not exactly. It's a hollow ache, a profound sense of meaninglessness, hiding behind a perfect smile. This is the pretty lie we tell ourselves, that a well-decorated life is a well-lived one, and it's into this crack, this quiet desperation, that the modern myth of spiritual awakening seeps in, promising a beautiful, ethereal escape. Social media feeds paint a picture of instant bliss, and of manifesting a new reality with a few positive thoughts. A world of only love and light, where every day is a sun-drenched yoga retreat. They sell you a convenient, marketable enlightenment, a quick fix for the soul. But this is the greatest, most beautiful lie of all, because a true spiritual awakening, the kind that remakes you from the inside out, is not pretty. It is a demolition. It is a confrontation in the dark, a brutal and disorienting process of shedding your own skin. It is chaos, confusion, and the breaking of everything you held to be true. It is a confession of the soul. And this is my confession. My guide on this treacherous path wasn't a guru on a mountaintop, but a collection of voices, whispering secrets of the universe directly into my ear. Through the humble, intimate technology of the audiobook. These weren't just books. They were lifelines, secret mentors on long drives and lonely nights. Their words becoming the soundtrack to my own undoing and eventual rebirth. This is the true story of what it means to wake up. Not to a prettier world, but to a more real one. The first crack in the facade is never a dramatic, shattering event. It doesn't arrive with the force of a wrecking ball or the roar of an earthquake. It is quieter, more insidious. It is the subtle, hairline fracture that you can only see when the light hits it just right. For me, that light was often the sterile, fluorescent glow of my corner office long after everyone else had gone home. Or the low, golden light of a setting sun glinting off the hood of my expensive, silent car as I sat in traffic. My life was a fortress, built brick by brick with achievements, accolades, and the quiet, firm approval of society. I had the right degree, the right job title, the right address, and a social calendar that was both enviable and exhausting. I had meticulously followed the blueprint for a successful life, and the structure stood tall and impressive, a testament to discipline and ambition. From the outside, it was impenetrable, but from the inside, it had begun to feel like a very elaborate, very beautiful tomb. The emptiness was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. It was the taste of my morning espresso, which cost $7 but tasted of nothing. It was the breathtaking panoramic view of the city from my window, which I no longer saw as a vibrant, living metropolis, but as a static, two-dimensional painting. It was the sound of laughter at cocktail parties, a sound that seemed to travel through water before it reached my ears. Distant and distorted, I was the ghost at my own feast, the lead actor in a play about my own life, reciting lines I had memorized but no longer felt. And in the quiet moments, the question would always return, not as a shout, but as a patient, persistent whisper from the marrow of my bones. Is this all there is? I would push it down, smother it with another project, another workout, another purchase, I told myself this was just adult life. This was maturity. The vibrant colors of youth were supposed to fade into sensible, respectable shades of gray. To want more was to be childish. Ungrateful, so I praised my fortress, polished its walls, and ignored the chilling draft coming from the crack in its foundation. The universe, however, is a persistent suitor for our attention. When we refuse to listen to its whispers, it begins to leave small, curious breadcrumbs in our path. They were trivial things. At first, I'd glance at the clock and see 11 or 3:33 with unnerving frequency. I'd be thinking of a forgotten song from my childhood, and it would suddenly start playing on the cafe's radio. I had a recurring dream. Not a nightmare, but a deeply unsettling dream of standing in a library where all the books were blank. I would wake up with a profound sense of loss, a feeling that lingered long after the dream itself had faded. Once, waiting for my coffee, the elderly janitor who was quietly mopping the floor looked up at me, his eyes clear and direct, and said, "Don't forget to look up today. The clouds are doing something special." I mumbled a polite reply and forgot about it, until hours later, stuck in a moment of deep frustration at my desk. I remembered his words and glanced out the window. The sky was filled with the most extraordinary, rippling waves of clouds, painted in hues of orange and violet I had never seen before. It was a spectacle of breathtaking beauty, a secret masterpiece being performed for an audience of no one, and it lasted for maybe 5 minutes before it dissolved. I dismissed these things as coincidences, as the brain's pattern-seeking tendencies, yet each one left a small, indelible mark, a tiny, puzzling clue that suggested the world was perhaps more mysterious and interactive than my rigid, illogical worldview allowed. The true catalyst, the moment the hairline crack became a definite, undeniable fissure, arrived in the most mundane of settings, my car. On a Tuesday evening, I was driving home, encased in leather and brushed steel, my mind numb from a day of successful negotiations and hollow victories. The usual playlist of upbeat, motivational music felt like a mockery. The business podcast sounded like a foreign language. The silence was even worse, because it was in the silence that the question lived. I needed noise. I needed a distraction. I opened my audiobook app, my thumb scrolling aimlessly past the recommended thrillers and biographies and self-help guides for crushing it. I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for anesthesia. Mi finger hova. And then, for a reason I will never be able to explain, it stopped on a title with a stark, minimalist cover. It was called something like The Cartography of Stillness. It sounded pretentious and utterly boring. And for that reason, it felt safe. There would be no jarring plot twists, no annoying productivity hacks. Just, I assumed, monotonous, intellectual noise. I pressed play. A man's voice, calm and unhurried, filled the car. It was gentle, like the flow of water over smooth stones. He spoke of ancient philosophies, of forgotten ways of seeing the world. I was half listening, my mind focused on the brake lights ahead, my thoughts already planning tomorrow's meetings. I was letting the words wash over me without absorbing them. And then, he said a sentence that was so simple, so direct. It bypassed my cynical intellect entirely and struck something deep within me, something I didn't even know was there. He said, "You have spent your entire life building a magnificent cage, decorating its bars with gold and winning awards for its design. But have you ever once stopped to ask what bird was meant to sing inside it?" The world stopped. The blare of traffic, the hum of the engine, the entire external reality faded into an irrelevant buzz. That one question detonated in the quiet of my soul. A cage. A beautiful, celebrated cage. In one blinding flash of insight, I saw it. I saw the bars of my job title, the lock of my reputation, the golden feed cup of my salary. I saw my entire life, my fortress of success, for what it truly was, an elaborate prison I had built for myself. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The air in the car felt thick, unbreathable. It wasn't a sad feeling. It was a feeling of pure, terrifying, exhilarating truth. The truth had arrived, not in a holy book or a divine vision, but through a random audiobook chosen as a distraction. The crack in the facade of my perfect life was no longer a secret I could hide. It had been split wide open, not by a great force from the outside, but by a single, perfectly aimed whisper from within. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I turned the audiobook off, but the question echoed in the silence, reverberating through me. When I finally pulled into my driveway and walked into my architect-designed house, filled with tasteful furniture and muted colors, I felt like a trespasser for the very first time. I didn't try to patch the crack or run from the emptiness. I stood in the center of my beautiful, silent cage, and I finally allowed myself to feel the profound, aching absence of the bird that was supposed to be singing. The search for a distraction was over. A much more perilous and far more important search had just begun. The house was the same, but I was not. The silence that I once filled with noise now pulsed with the echo of that one devastating question about the caged bird. The fortress I had built was no longer a source of pride. It was a crime scene, and I was both the victim and the perpetrator. My first instinct, the instinct of a lifetime of logical A-to-B thinking, was to find the culprit. I went back to the source, the digital well from which that drop of poison, or perhaps medicine, had come. I found the audiobook again, the cartography of stillness. And this time, I didn't listen for distraction. I listened for clues. I sat in my expensive armchair, the one that looked better than it felt, and I pressed play, not as a passive commuter, but as a detective searching for meaning in the wreckage of my own life. The narrator's voice, once just a calming drone, and now felt like a key turning in a lock deep inside me. He began to speak of reality not as a fixed, solid thing, but as a fluid, responsive medium. He called it a mirror. The world does not happen to you, the voice calmly explained. It happens from you. It is a perfect, flawless mirror reflecting back to you the truth of your own inner state. My mind, the well-trained, skeptical CEO of my inner world, immediately went on the attack. It produced 1,000 arguments, a flood of logical refutations. What about poverty? What about disease? What about accidents? It was absurd, offensive, solipsistic nonsense. It was the thinking of a child. And yet, beneath the loud, indignant protests of my intellect, a quieter part of me, the part that had recognized the cage, simply listened. It didn't argue. It just felt a strange, unnerving resonance, a hum of familiarity, as if I were being reminded of a language I once knew but had long forgotten. This audiobook led to another, and another. I had stumbled into a hidden digital ecosystem, a rabbit hole of cosmic secrets disguised as self-help. The titles were intriguing, promising forbidden knowledge, the physics of belief, vibrational alchemy, conversations with consciousness. I devoured them. I listened while I jogged through pristine suburban streets, the narrator's voice explaining that the solid pavement beneath my feet was, at its core, 9% empty space and vibrating energy. I listened while I chopped vegetables for a solitary dinner, hearing that my own emotional state was imprinting a frequency onto the very food I was about to consume. I listened in the bath, the steam rising around me as a gentle voice suggested that my consciousness was not contained within my head, but was a field of awareness in which my body and the entire universe were appearing. This was the hook my logical mind so desperately needed. The authors, many of them, cleverly wove in the language of quantum physics. They spoke of the observer effect, proposing that just as a subatomic particle remains a wave of pure potential until it is observed, so too does our reality remain fluid until our focus, our belief, our consciousness, collapses it into a specific experience. They spoke of quantum entanglement as a metaphor for our interconnectedness. Was it rigorous science? My CEO mind screamed that it was not. It was a gross misapplication of complex theories. But it didn't matter. It was a powerful, seductive idea. It gave this mystical worldview a thin, but crucial, veneer of intellectual plausibility. It was the spoonful of sugar that helped the medicine of a completely new reality go down. This secret education created a strange, thrilling duality in my life. On the surface, I was the same. I went to meetings. I analyzed data. I spoke of profits and projections. But inwardly, I was living in a completely different cosmos. While my colleagues discussed the stock market, I was silently contemplating whether their collective anxiety was measurably affecting it. I felt like a spy, gathering intelligence from another dimension while operating deep within enemy territory, the territory of a mundane, clockwork world I no longer fully believed in. After weeks of this immersive, secret learning, the theoretical was no longer enough. Curiosity, that irresistible human impulse, began to demand practice. The audiobooks were not just philosophical treatises, they were instruction manuals. They suggested experiments, small ways to test the fabric of this new reality. I felt profound foolish, even embarrassed, alone in my own home. But the whisper of what if had become too loud to ignore. I chose one of the simplest, least outlandish-seeming practices, scripting. The instructions were to write down my desired reality in detail, but to write it in the past tense, as if it had already happened, and to focus on the feeling of it. One night, after locking my study door as if I were about to engage in some illicit activity, I opened a fresh, empty notebook. My pen hovered over the page, my mind blank with resistance and self-consciousness. Then, I took a deep breath, and I began to write. I didn't write about winning the lottery or becoming the CEO of the world. The books had warned against that. They said the universe responds to feeling, not to things. So I wrote about a day. I am so happy and grateful now that I have experienced such a perfect, flowing day. I wrote, my handwriting feeling alien and clumsy. I woke up feeling rested and light. An incredible, innovative idea for the new project came to me effortlessly in the shower. Every traffic light on my way to work turned green. My difficult meeting was canceled. And instead, I had a surprisingly deep and honest conversation with a colleague I barely knew. I felt connected, creative, and at ease all day. I wrote pages of it, describing the taste of my coffee, the feeling of the sun on my skin, the genuine smile I shared with a stranger. The act of writing it, of physically forming the words, was transformative. It was a conscious act of creation. It wasn't wishing, it was, in a strange way, remembering a state of being that felt more true than the one I was currently living. I closed the notebook and hid it in a drawer. My face flushed as if I'd just written a love letter. The skeptical part of my mind was laughing, calling me a fool. But something had shifted. The central question of my inner dialogue had fundamentally changed. For weeks, the dominant question had been, what if this is all nonsense? It was a question born of fear, a defense mechanism to protect my carefully constructed, albeit miserable, reality. But now, a new question began to take its place. It rose up from that quiet, resonant place within me, and it was filled with a terrifying, exhilarating power. What if this is true? What if the whispers are right? What if my thoughts, my feelings, my beliefs are not just reactions to the world, but are in fact the very brushes with which I painted into existence? The sheer weight of that possibility was immense. It was the ultimate responsibility. It meant I had no one to blame. Not my parents, not my boss, not society. The architect of my beautiful, empty cage was me. The hand that had turned the key in the lock was my own. This was not a happy thought. It was a crushing blow to the victimhood I hadn't even realized I was clinging to. But in that crushing, there was also freedom. If I was the one who had built the prison, then I was also the one who held the key. I stood at the threshold, no longer just a curious observer of a strange new philosophy, but a reluctant and terrified potential participant. I decided, in that moment, to commit to the experiment. I would suspend my disbelief. I would step through the looking glass and see what this whispered reality had in store. Having made the silent, solemn pact to step through the looking glass, my life transformed into a grand, secret experiment. I became a detective of my own reality, a scientist in the laboratory of my days. And my hypothesis was simple, that the world was listening. I moved through my old routines, but with a new layer of awareness. A constant, humming alertness. I was no longer just a passive participant, I was an active player, consciously placing my attention like a chess master placing a piece on the board, then sitting back to watch the game respond. I was looking for proof, for little winks from the universe, for any sign that my whispered intentions were being heard in the vast, silent cosmos. And to my astonishment, the universe began to wink back. The first successes were small. So small, they were almost deniable, easily dismissed by the lingering skeptic in my mind as mere coincidence. The classic one happened first, the parking spot. I was heading to a notoriously crowded downtown market on a Saturday morning, a place where finding a parking spot typically involved 20 minutes of predatory circling and a spike in blood pressure. But this time, as I approached, I decided to try the experiment. I closed my eyes for just 3 seconds, ignoring the horns blaring behind me. And I didn't just wish for a spot. I felt it. I felt the specific, satisfying feeling of relief as you see the empty space. I felt the smooth turn of the steering wheel. I felt the gentle bump as the tires hit the curb. I opened my eyes and turned the corner onto the main street. And right there, directly in front of the entrance, a car's reverse lights flashed on. The driver pulled out, leaving a perfect, empty space, as if it had been reserved just for me. A jolt, like a low-voltage electric current, shot through me. It was a coincidence, my logical mind insisted. But the feeling was one of magic. A few days later, a different kind of proof arrived. I was listening to an audiobook about vibrational alignment, and the narrator spoke about how our focused, emotionalized attention on another person can be felt across any distance. I started thinking about an old friend from college, someone I had been incredibly close with but had lost touch with over the years due to the simple, slow drift of life. A wave of genuine affection and nostalgia washed over me. I remembered his laugh, our stupid inside jokes. Instead of just letting the memory pass, I held on to it. For about 5 minutes, I simply sat in my office, closed my eyes, and sent him love. I pictured him happy, successful, and laughing. I didn't plan to call him. The experiment was just to send the feeling. The very next afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and his voice was on the other end. After the initial, Joyful shock. He said the words that made the hair on my arms stand up. This is going to sound so weird, but I was thinking about you non-stop yesterday for some reason. I just had to call. The fortress of my skepticism began to crumble. This was harder to explain away. Then came the coffee. It became my signature test. A fun, low-stakes game. I played with the cosmos. One morning, I was rushing, feeling the familiar pinch of the end of a pay cycle. I wanted my expensive $7 lat, but I felt a twinge of guilt about spending the money. So, I decided to order it from the universe, as one of the books had playfully suggested. As I stood in the long line, I didn't just wish for a free coffee. I inhabited the reality of it. I smelled the roasted beans. I felt the imagined warmth of the cup in my hands. I tasted the rich, bitter flavor. By the time I got to the counter, I had fully accepted I was going to pay for it. But the game was the thing. I gave the barista my order. As he turned to the machine, he paused and looked at a little sign on his register. He turned back to me with a grin. "Well, what do you know?" he said. "You are our 100th customer of the day. Your order is on the house." He handed me the cup, and it felt heavier than it should. Weighted with the impossible. I walked out of the cafe in a daze. A secret, giddy smile spreading across my face. This succession of small, inexplicable events created an intoxicating feedback loop. The more I believed, the more proof I received. The more proof I received, the more I believed. I felt like Neo in the Matrix right after he first dodges a bullet. A dawning, electrifying realization that the rules were not what I thought they were. I had found a cheat code for reality. Life was no longer a grim, uphill battle against random, chaotic forces. It was a dance. It was a game. It was a malleable, responsive medium that I could shape and influence with my own internal state. My confidence, once a brittle thing based on external validation, began to soar. I walked differently, with a new lightness in my step. I found myself smiling at strangers. I carried a secret, a profound and powerful secret that made the mundane world seem vibrant and alive with infinite possibility. But this is where the most dangerous part of the journey began. The ego, that part of me that had been temporarily silenced by awe and wonder, saw its chance. It saw this new power not as a sacred connection, but as a shiny new tool for its own aggrandizement. The initial joy of co-creation began to curdle into a desire for control. My perspective shifted subtly. I began to see the universe less as a mysterious, intelligent dance partner and more as a cosmic vending machine. If I just inserted the right coin, the right affirmation, the right visualization, the right feeling state, then the universe was obligated to dispense my chosen snack. My journal, which had started as a place of genuine gratitude, began to read like a list of demands for a cosmic personal assistant. I wasn't just creating a feeling of ease anymore. I was trying to manifest a specific promotion at work, trying to make a specific person text me back, trying to acquire a specific luxury watch I'd seen in a magazine. The magic became a formula. The wonder became an expectation. The relationship became a transaction. I was no longer the humble scientist in the lab. I was becoming a petty tyrant, issuing decrees to the cosmos and tapping my foot with impatience when my orders were not immediately fulfilled. The honeymoon was glorious, a sun-drenched period of endless possibility and delightful surprises. But my own ego was leading me out of the light and towards a wall I couldn't see. I was about to learn that the universe is not a vending machine that responds to demands. It is a mirror that reflects your truth. And it was about to hold up that mirror and show me a greedy, impatient, and controlling part of myself that I wasn't at all prepared to see. The cheat code was about to glitch. The honeymoon ended, as all honeymoons do. Not with a single, dramatic event, but with the slow, creeping dawn of a reality that refused to bend to my will. The universe, which had been my playful accomplice in a game of cosmic hide-and-seek, suddenly seemed to grow quiet and indifferent. The giddy confidence I had built upon a foundation of parking spots and free coffees was about to be tested against the bedrock of my real, deep-seated desire. The next logical prize in the game I was playing was a major promotion at work. It was a position I had been working towards for years. The next gleaming brick in the fortress of my success. Now, armed with what I believed were the cheat codes to reality, I considered it a foregone conclusion. I was no longer hoping for it. I was manifesting it. My secret, spiritual life kicked into high gear. Every morning, I would sit in meditation and vividly imagine myself in the new, bigger office. I scripted pages in my journal, writing in exquisity, past tense detail about the congratulatory handshake from my boss, the envy in my rival's eyes, the feeling of profound satisfaction as I updated my professional profile online. I walked around in a state of what the audiobooks called acting, as if trying to embody the confidence and authority of the executive I was determined to become. I was doing everything right. I was following all the rules. I had placed my order with the cosmic vending machine, and now I was waiting, with a growing sense of entitlement, for my snack to be dispensed. The day of the announcement came, and the promotion went to someone else. Someone from the outside. Someone I felt was objectively less qualified and had not earned it. The news didn't just land like a thud. It was a gut punch that knocked the wind out of me, leaving me gasping in a silent, empty conference room. The shock was immediate, followed by a hot, bitter wave of disbelief and then a cold, heavy stone of disappointment in my stomach. The universe wasn't just silent, it felt cruel. The game was rigged. My magical thinking had been a foolish, childish delusion. But what came next was even worse than the disappointment. It was the guilt. The spiritual teachings I had so eagerly consumed now turned on me, their gentle encouragement twisting into a voice of harsh self-recrimination. If it's not working, it's your vibration. The thought echoed in my mind. The disappointment I felt was a low-vibration emotion. Therefore, I had manifested this failure myself. My own sadness and anger were the culprits. This created a toxic, inescapable spiral. I felt disappointed, and then I felt desperately guilty for feeling disappointed. I felt a surge of anger and jealousy, and then I felt a wave of panic that this negative energy would only push my desires further away. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, where the very emotions that made me human were now evidence of my spiritual failure. I wasn't just failing at my career, I was failing at manifesting, failing at being a conscious creator, failing at this new identity that had become so precious to me. This is when the mantras became lies. I doubled down on the techniques, trying to brute force my vibration back to a high level. I would stand in front of the mirror, my eyes hollow, my jaw tight with suppressed rage, and force myself to chant the words. I am worthy. I am abundant. I am successful. Everything is always working out for me. The words felt like sandpaper in my mouth. They were a profound and obvious lie. And the person in the mirror knew it. My body knew it. Every cell was screaming in protest, saturated with the very real, very valid feelings of hurt and injustice. But I was trying to shout down this authentic inner reality with a flimsy, borrowed vocabulary of positivity. It was a form of self-gaslighting, an internal war between the truth of my experience and the dogma I was trying to impose upon it. And it was utterly exhausting. I had discovered the dark side of the light. I had fallen into the trap of toxic positivity. I had built a new cage for myself, even more restrictive than the old one. In this cage, I was not allowed to be sad. I was not allowed to be angry. I was not allowed to feel envy or grief or frustration, because these were bad vibrations that would attract more bad things. I became terrified of my own feelings, monitoring my internal state like a hypervigilant prison guard. If a negative thought appeared, I would try to wrestle it to the ground and replace it with a positive one. I became emotionally constipated, unable to genuinely process my own life. I was attempting to live as a caricature of a spiritual person, rather than as a whole human being. I hit a new low, a place of profound disillusionment. The path that had promised freedom had led me to a new and more insidious form of bondage. In a moment of quiet desperation one evening, feeling like a complete failure, I scrolled through my audiobook library. I couldn't bear to listen to another cheerful narrator telling me to just think positive. My soul craved something real, something that would meet me in the muddy, messy truth of my current state. I scrolled past all the books about manifestation and abundance, and my eye caught a different kind of title. It was something like The Sanctuary of the Difficult Emotion. It promised no 7-step plan, no secret techniques. It simply offered a new perspective, with nothing left to lose. I pressed play. The narrator's voice was different. It was quieter, deeper, and it held a quality of profound compassion. And the message was revolutionary. It was an antidote. The voice didn't tell me to change my feelings. It told me to honor them. It introduced me to the concept of radical acceptance, of meeting myself with unconditional kindness, right where I was. Your disappointment is not a vibrational failure, the voice said gently. It is the measure of your hope. Your anger is not a toxic energy, it is a sacred fire. A loyal guardian telling you that something you value has been violated. These feelings are not obstacles on your path. They are the path. A sob escaped my lips. A sound that came from a place so deep inside me, I didn't know it existed. It was the sound of a prisoner being set free. I was being given permission. Permission to be human. Permission to be messy. Permission to feel the full, untamed spectrum of my own experience without judgment. The tension I had been holding in my shoulders for weeks began to dissolve. I took the first deep, a breath I had taken in days. I realized then that true spirituality, true power, wasn't about plastering a fake smile over my pain. It was about having the courage to sit with my pain, to listen to it, to ask it what it had come to teach me. It was about creating an inner sanctuary where all my feelings were welcome guests. The goal wasn't to live in a state of perpetual, manufactured bliss. The goal was to become a person who was strong enough and compassionate enough to hold it all. This profound relief immediately opened a new door. If these negative feelings were not problems to be eradicated, but messengers to be heard, then the next question was obvious. What message were they bringing? This was no longer about manipulating the universe to get what I wanted. It was about allowing the universe, through my own internal world, to show me who I truly was. And that meant turning to face the darkness I had been running from my entire life. The permission to feel was a key, but it opened a door into a room I wasn't prepared to enter. It was one thing to allow myself to feel disappointment and anger. It was another thing entirely to ask where they came from. This new, more courageous line of inquiry led me away from the bright, sunny promises of the manifestation section of my audiobook library and into its deeper, more dimly lit archives. I found myself drawn to titles that spoke not of attracting, but of understanding, titles on mythology, on depth psychology, on the work of thinkers like Carl Jung. A new, more challenging phase of my education was beginning. It was here, in these hushed and scholarly recordings, that I first met my own shadow. I'd stumbled upon an audiobook that explained Jung's concept of the shadow self, the vast, unconscious repository of all the parts of ourselves we have disowned. It is the psychic dumping ground for every impulse, every desire, every trait that we, in our childhood and adolescence, were taught was unacceptable. Our anger, our vulnerability, our fierce ambition, our wildness, our sensuality, our greed. These things don't simply vanish when we repress them. They live on, in the dark, growing more potent in their exile. And the book explained the primary mechanism by which the shadow operates: projection. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And more specifically, we see our own disowned darkness reflected back at us in the faces of others. This was the universe as a mirror concept, but on a level that was terrifyingly intimate and profoundly unsettling. The first version I learned was simple and attractive: think happy thoughts, I'll see a happy world. This new version was its grim and complex counterpart: everything you judge, hate, and cannot stand in another person is a direct reflection of a part of yourself that you have refused to acknowledge. The people who trigger you, the ones who can ignite a firestorm of rage or a tidal wave of judgment within you with a single comment or action, are not your enemies. They are your most dedicated, if unwitting, spiritual teachers. They are messengers, sent from the depths of your own psyche, wearing the costume of your own rejected self. They are showing you the parts of you that are begging to be seen and integrated. My mind immediately rebelled against this. It's a deeply offensive idea. It shatters the victim narrative that is so central to the ego's identity. My first reaction was a litany of justifications. No, that person is just objectively a jerk. I am nothing like them. My anger is justified, but the audiobook was patient, relentless. It guided me to perform an exercise, to think of a person who consistently provoked a strong negative reaction in me. Immediately, my mind went to my career, and I saw a recurring pattern. A parade of authority figures and bosses whom I had always categorized as domineering, arrogant micromanagers. My story had always been that I was simply unlucky, a magnet for bad leadership, that I, the competent and agreeable team player, was constantly being thwarted by egotistical tyrants. Following the audiobook's guidance, I focused on my most recent boss, a man whose condescending tone and constant need for control had been the source of immense frustration. I am nothing like him, I insisted to myself, but the gentle, probing voice of the narrator asked the questions I had never dared to ask myself. What, specifically, about him triggers you? It asked. His arrogance, I thought. The voice replied. Where in your life have you repressed your own pride in your abilities for fear of being called arrogant? Where have you shrunk so that others could feel big? The question hit me like a physical blow. Then another. His need for control infuriates you. Where in your own life have you given away your power? Where have you abdicated your own sovereignty and then resented others for taking control? And the final, deepest cut. His power and authority make you uncomfortable. What is your relationship with your own power? The power you have disowned. The ambition you have labeled as unspiritual or unbecoming. The part of you that secretly wants to be in charge. The dam of my denial broke. A lifetime of repressed ambition, of being the nice guy, the good employee, of swallowing my own ideas to keep the peace, flooded my awareness. I saw with sickening clarity that my intense frustration with these bosses was not just about them. It was about the parts of myself they mirrored back to me. Their arrogance shone a spotlight on my own false humility. Their tyrannical control was a constant, screaming reminder of my own lack of personal sovereignty. I had disowned my own desire for power, my own inner leader. Because I was afraid of it, I had judged it as bad. And so, the universe, in its perfect, impersonal wisdom, kept sending me powerful, controlling people to show me what I was missing. They were external manifestations of my own internal, exiled king. The problem was not the boss. The problem was the empty throne within me. This is the point where the journey truly earns its title. Spiritual awakening isn't pretty. This work, this shadow work, is brutal. It is the absolute opposite of love and light. It requires a kind of ruthless honesty that feels like self-betrayal at first. It means looking at your own cherished victim stories and admitting they are fiction. It means taking absolute ownership of your emotional reactions, acknowledging that the world isn't doing anything to you. It is merely triggering what is already inside you. It is humbling in the most painful way possible. You are forced to confront your own hypocrisy, your own pettiness, your own quiet feelings of superiority and judgment that you have so cleverly disguised as righteous indignation. There is no romance in it. It is the grimy, thankless work of psychic housekeeping, of going into the basement of your soul with a flashlight and seeing the spiders and the mold you've been pretending weren't there. But the audiobooks on this topic also emphasized a critical counterpoint: self-compassion. The goal is not to hate your shadow, the goal is to understand it. To ask it, when did I decide you were unacceptable? Who taught me that this part of me was bad? How was this repression a strategy for survival? You learn that most of your shadow was born in childhood, as a way to earn love and ensure safety. You didn't banish your anger because you were evil. You banished it because it wasn't safe to be angry in your family. You didn't disown your vulnerability because you were cold. You disowned it because you were taught it was weakness. The work, then, is not one of exorcism, but of reunion. It is a slow, tender process of welcoming these lost, frightened parts of yourself back into the fold, of telling them they are finally safe, and they are welcome. It is the path from self-improvement to self-integration. As I began this messy, painful process of owning my projections, of seeing my own disowned face in the people I judged, an inevitable consequence began to unfold. The very foundation of my life, which had been built upon the denial of my whole self, began to tremble. The career where I had succeeded by being the agreeable subordinate, the friendships that were based on me being the accommodating peacekeeper, the entire persona I had carefully crafted, it all began to feel like a lie. It was a suit that no longer fit. By beginning to integrate my shadow, I was changing my fundamental vibration, my soul's signature. And the unchangeable law of this mirrored universe is that your outer world must eventually conform to your inner one. The things in my life that were a match to the old, fractured me could no longer remain. The mirror wasn't just showing me my reflection anymore. It was compelling me to clean my house, and I soon learned that house cleaning on a soul level often looks like a demolition. The work of facing my shadow was not a neat, contained, internal process. It was a lit match dropped into the carefully managed ecosystem of my life. Once I began to acknowledge the disowned parts of myself, my ambition, my anger, my deep-seated need for authentic expression, I could no longer comfortably wear the masks I had worn for decades. The persona of the agreeable easygoing professional, the accommodating friend, the successful man who had everything figured out, began to feel like a costume made of sandpaper, chafing and irritating my newly sensitive skin. The world hadn't changed, but I had. And because of that, my world had no choice but to change with me. This was the beginning of the Great Purge, a period of profound and painful loss that, at the time, felt like the end of everything. It started with my relationships. The friendships that had been built on the foundations of my old self began to show cracks. These connections, many of them years old, were predicated on a certain unspoken contract. I was the good listener, the one who never rocked the boat, the one who would nod along with their complaints about their bosses and partners, reinforcing their victim narratives because it was easier than challenging them. Now, having seen my own projections, I could no longer participate in the same way. When they would complain, I would see the mirror. When they would cast blame, I would see their disowned shadow. My silence, once perceived as supportive, was now interpreted as judgmental. When I tried, gently, to offer a different perspective, I wonder what that situation is meant to teach you. I was met with blank stares or defensive anger. The truth was, my healing was a threat to their status quo. I was a mirror they weren't ready to look into. There were no dramatic fights. It was quieter, And sadder than that, it was a slow, mutual drifting apart. A series of unanswered texts and canceled plans, until the silence became permanent. Each lost connection felt like a small death, leaving me feeling increasingly isolated and profoundly lonely. The centerpiece of the purge, however, was the collapse of my career. The job that had once been the primary source of my identity became an impossible stage to perform on, and blackened. My new, burgeoning authenticity was in direct conflict with the corporate culture. The domineering boss was no longer just a trigger. Interacting with him felt like a betrayal of my own soul. A willing return to a cage I had just discovered. Where I once would have remained silent in a meeting, I now felt compelled to speak my truth, even if it was unpopular. Where I once would have passively accepted a decision I knew was wrong, I now questioned it. I was no longer playing the game. To my superiors, this didn't look like spiritual growth. It looked like insubordination. I was no longer a team player. I was becoming difficult. The inevitable finally happened during a tense project meeting. I spoke up, pointing out a fundamental flaw in a strategy. And my words, though true, I were not what leadership wanted to hear. The confrontation was quiet, professional, and utterly final. A few weeks later, my position was made redundant. I was laid off. The terror of that moment was absolute. The job was more than a salary. It was the central pillar of my ego, identity. It was the proof that I was successful, worthy, and safe. Losing it felt like I had been stripped naked in the town square. It was a catastrophic failure. And my ego, that frightened voice in my head, screamed with a bitter, triumphant, "I told you so." See, it hissed. This is what happens when you listen to all that spiritual nonsense. This is what you get for being authentic. Ruin. I felt lost, untethered from everything I knew. For a few weeks, I was in a state of freefall, a period of such intense desolation and fear that it can only be described as the dark night of the soul. I felt utterly and completely alone, abandoned by the universe that I had, just a few months prior, believed was my magical partner. The temptation to panic, to immediately start applying for similar jobs, to try and frantically rebuild the old fortress, was immense. But I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I couldn't go back. The mask was broken, and I could never wear it again. It was in this darkness that my relationship with my audiobooks changed once more. I wasn't looking for techniques or knowledge now. I was looking for a lifeline. I was looking for a single, steady voice in the howling wind of my own fear. I scrolled through my library and found a book on the concept of Dharma, or life's purpose. I pressed play, not with curiosity, but with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a piece of driftwood. The narrator's voice was calm, steady, and it met me in my despair. It spoke of the necessity of such purges. It explained that the universe, in its infinite love and wisdom, will often bulldoze the life we have built if that life is keeping us from the life we were meant to live. It said that we often must lose everything we thought we wanted in order to create space for what our soul truly needs. One sentence from that audiobook became my mantra through this dark period. The breakdown is not the end of the story. It is the necessary clearing of the land before the true construction can begin. I clung to those words. I repeated them to myself when I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat of financial panic. I listened to them as I took long, aimless walks through a city that now felt alien to me. The words began to slowly, painstakingly reframe my catastrophe. The job loss was not a punishment. It was a liberation. My shrinking social circle was not a rejection. It was a purification. The universe hadn't abandoned me. It had rescued me from a life that was too small for the person I was becoming. Slowly, tentatively, the crushing weight of failure began to be replaced by a strange and unfamiliar sense of lightness. The terror was still present, a constant hum in the background, but it was now mixed with an undeniable feeling of freedom. I was free from the pointless meetings, from the soul-crushing commute, from the obligation to pretend. My calendar was empty. My identity was a blank page. The destruction was complete, and in the vast, empty space that it left behind, a new question began to form. A question that could only arise when all the external definitions of self had been stripped away. If I am not my job title, not my salary, not my list of accomplishments, not my circle of friends, then who or what am I? The great purge of my outer world had been a violent, messy, and terrifying blessing. It had razed the external structures to the ground, leaving me with nowhere else to turn. It had forced me into an empty room, face to face with the terrified, chattering voice in my head that was screaming in the silence. It was time to meet the architect of the old life, the warden of the prison I had just escaped from. It was time to meet my own ego. The great purge had left me in a stark, empty room. The furniture of my identity, my job, my social status, my predictable routine had all been hauled away. In the silence, with no external distractions to numb me, the voice in my head became a deafening roar. It was the voice of fear, a relentless narrator spinning tales of my own catastrophic failure. "You've ruined everything," it would chatter. Its tone, a venomous mix of panic and accusation. "You had a perfect life, and you threw it all away for some spiritual fantasy. What are you going to do now? You have no plan, no prospects. You are a fool." This voice was my constant companion in the void, a tormentor that lived inside my own skull. I had always assumed this voice was me. It was my thoughts, my personality. But now, with everything else stripped away, I was forced to look closer. Guided by the next phase of my audiobook education, which had shifted into the realms of mindfulness and presence, I found a new set of teachers. Voices that spoke not of changing reality, but of simply observing it through their words. I was formally introduced to the entity that had been running my life, the ego. I learned that the ego was not some malicious demon to be vanquished. It was a survival mechanism, born out of necessity in my childhood. Its prime directive was to protect a fragile sense of self by creating a story, an identity, and then defending it at all costs. It was the ultimate storyteller, constantly narrating a dramatic tale of a separate, vulnerable me trying to make its way in a dangerous and competitive world. I learned its characteristics like I was studying an animal in the wild. It lived exclusively in the past and the future, endlessly chewing on old regrets and rehearsing future anxieties. Completely incapable of resting in the present moment, it survived on comparison and judgment, creating hierarchies of success and failure, right and wrong, to know where I stood. It was an overprotective parent that had helped me survive childhood but was now suffocating my adult self in its fearful embrace. The audiobooks were clear. The goal was not to kill the ego, but to lovingly relieve it of a job it was never qualified to do, being the master of my life. The primary practice was deceptively simple: to watch the thinker, to sit in silence and simply witness the stream of thoughts, feelings, and sensations without getting swept away by them. In the beginning, this felt impossible. My mind was a raging, untamed river of thought, and attempting to sit on the riverbank as a neutral observer felt like trying to stop a tsunami with a picket fence. For every second I managed to stay present as the watcher, I would be immediately swept away for minutes at a time, lost in a new current of worry or a memory of regret, completely forgetting I was supposed to be observing. I would get frustrated, judging myself for my monkey mind, which, as one narrator pointedly explained, was simply the ego, judging the ego of its favorite and most pointless games. The breakthrough, the moment the world tilted on its axis, came while I was listening to one of these guided meditations. I wasn't doing anything special. I was just sitting on a park bench. The sounds of the city, a distant hum. The narrator's voice was calm, a steady anchor in the storm of my mind. He wasn't teaching a complex theory. He was simply asking a question. Notice the stream of your thinking. He said softly, listen to the voice in your head as you would listen to the sound of traffic or the song of a bird. Can you recognize that it is a phenomenon? Something that is happening in you? I followed the instruction. I listened to the familiar litany of worries about my finances and my future. Then the narrator delivered the pivotal instruction. Now, gently ask yourself this question. Who is aware of these thoughts? Who is the one that is listening to this voice? He paused, then added, do not try to find an answer with your mind. The mind cannot grasp it. Simply rest in the silent space of the question itself. I let the question sink in. Who is aware? Who is listening? My mind scrambled for an answer. Well, it's me. Obviously, but I followed the instruction to let that thought go. I just stayed with the question itself. And then, it happened. For a single, eternal second, the voice in my head stopped. The incessant stream of thought ceased entirely. It was not a void. It was not nothingness. It was a state of pure, vibrant, silent awareness. It was a peace so profound and so absolute it was beyond any emotion I had ever known. In that silent gap, there was no story of me. The failure. There was no past to regret or future to fear. There was only being, and in that moment of pure, direct experience, the truth landed with the force of a revelation. I am not the voice in my head. I am the silence that hears it. I am not the thinker. I am the awareness in which the thoughts appear and disappear. This realization was a double-edged sword of exquisite liberation and existential terror. The freedom was absolute. If I am not my thoughts, then I am not my fears, my anxieties, my self-judgments, my story of failure. They are just weather patterns passing through the vast sky of my awareness. But this was a direct threat to the ego's existence, which is entirely dependent on my belief in its story. And so, it rushed back in with a vengeance, desperate to reclaim its territory. What was that? It chattered. That was amazing. How do I get it back? Am I enlightened now? I need to do this more often. It tried to turn the experience of no thought into another thought, another concept to be possessed and analyzed. The dance of my new spiritual life became this constant, gentle act of noticing. I had been carried away by the river of thought. And then, without judgment, returning to the silent riverbank of awareness. Again and again and again. This process is what is meant by the death of the ego. It is not a single, violent event. It is a slow, gradual disidentification. It is the death of an illusion. I began to watch the ego's antics with a kind of compassionate detachment. I saw its fear-based strategies, its desperate need for approval, its childish tantrums. It was like watching a notoriously dramatic actor on a stage. I could appreciate the performance, but I no longer had to believe the lines were real. I no longer had to confuse the actor with my true self. This dismantling of my old identity, however, left me in a new and unnerving territory. The ego, for all its flaws, had been the one in the driver's seat for my entire life. It was the planner, the striver, the controller, with its authority now fatally undermined. I was left with a terrifying, liberating question. If the thinking mind is no longer in charge, then who, or what, is? How am I supposed to navigate my life, make decision, or know what to do next? I had learned to let go of the oars of my frantic paddling. Now I was being asked to trust the current of the river itself. I was being led, inexorably, to the necessity of a power I had never truly understood. The power of surrender, The death of the ego as my commander-in-chief left me in a state of profound and terrifying freedom. I was standing in the center of the void created by the Great Purge, and the tyrannical voice of the planner, the striver, and the controller had been reduced to a whisper. But in its place, there was a disorienting silence. The question that echoed in this new inner expanse was no longer, "Who am I?" but a far more practical and immediate one. What do I do now? My entire life had been a series of forceful actions, of setting goals and relentlessly pursuing them, of paddling with all my might against the currents of life to get where I thought I needed to go. Now, I felt as if my oars had been snapped in two, and I was simply adrift in a vast, unknowable ocean. My first instinct, the deeply ingrained programming of a lifetime, was to equate this state with failure. The word surrender itself was the problem. Tomi egu, which was still twitching in its weakened state. Surrender meant giving up, admitting defeat, becoming a passive victim of circumstance. It conjured images of laziness and apathy, of letting life simply happen to me. A voice of panic would rise up, screaming, "If you just float, you will starve. If you don't paddle, you will drift into a whirlpool. You have to do something." This was the voice of a world that worships effort, that glorifies the hustle, and that sees surrender as the ultimate weakness. I was terrified of letting go, because my mind could not conceive of any forward motion that wasn't generated by my own frantic, forceful effort. My audiobook library, once again, became my guide into this alien territory. I was led away from the psychological and into the philosophical, to the ancient wisdom of teachers who had mapped this very terrain centuries ago. I discovered the profound relief of Stoicism, listening to the calm, rational words of thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus. Through my headphones, I learned about the dichotomy of controlled, simple, revolutionary idea that the only things truly in our power are our own thoughts, judgments, and actions. Everything else what others think of us, our health, our wealth, the outcomes of our efforts is ultimately external and not up to us. The goal, the narrator explained, was not to control the world, but to master our response to it. This was a form of surrender. But it was not passive. It was a disciplined, powerful focus on the one thing I could actually control, my own inner state. Even more resonant was my discovery of the Tao Te Ching and the concept of Wu Wei. An audiobook narrator with a voice like ancient stone explained that Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. It means effortless action or non-forcing. It is the art of aligning your personal will with the great, natural flow of the universe, the Tao. The narrator used the metaphor of water. Water is the softest, most yielding thing in the world. Yet it overcomes all that is hard and rigid. It doesn't fight, it flows. It doesn't force its way through a rock. It gently wears it down or flows around it. To practice Wu Wei was to learn to be like water. It was to stop paddling against the current and instead learn to use the rudder, to steer with the subtle, intelligent flow of life itself. The greatest lesson in this art of surrender came through the very real, very painful area of my life that I had tried most desperately to control. My search for a romantic partner. For years, I had approached finding a relationship like a business acquisition. I had a mental checklist of desired qualities, a type I was trying to manifest. I would go on dates with a scrutinizing, interviewing energy. I used all the manifestation techniques I had learned, but with a desperate, grasping vibration, I would visualize specific people, script entière conversation, and try to force the universe to deliver my perfect person on my timeline. The result was a string of frustrating, short-lived connections that always left me feeling more empty. I was paddling so hard, creating so much frantic, needy turbulence in the water around me, that I was scaring all the fish away. After the purge and the ego work, I was exhausted, I saw the futility and the arrogance of my efforts. In a moment of profound clarity and weariness, I decided to conduct a new experiment. I decided to truly, completely surrender this desire. It was a conscious act. I wrote down every quality, every hope, every desperate desire I had for a partner on a long sheet of paper. I read it aloud one last time, acknowledged the longing, and then I burned it in a small bowl, watching the smoke curl up into the sky. I wasn't destroying the desire. I was releasing my attachment to the outcome. I was dropping the oars. I was telling the universe, I trust you. I am no longer in charge of this. Critically, this surrender did not lead to passivity. It led to a powerful shift in focus. The audiobooks on Taoism and self-love guided me. Instead of looking for someone to fill my emptiness, I focused on making my own life so full and joyful that I had no room for a needy relationship. I took myself on the dates I wished someone would take me on. I signed up for a pottery class I had always been curious about. I went for long hikes in the woods, listening not to audiobooks, but to the sounds of nature. I learned to enjoy my own company, to be my own best friend. My energy shifted from a magnetic polarity of I need to one of I am. I was no longer a half circle searching for its other half. I was becoming a whole circle, complete in myself. And then, when I had truly forgotten about the search, when I was genuinely, happily absorbed in my own life, it happened. It was nothing like I had ever visualized. It was simple, unexpected, and completely effortless. I met someone through my pottery class. The conversation was easy. The laughter was genuine. There was no game playing, no anxiety, no checklist running in the back of my mind. It was just two whole people, meeting in a state of mutual appreciation. The connection unfolded with the natural, graceful ease of a river flowing downhill. I didn't have to do anything to get it. I had to be someone to allow it. It was a perfect, living demonstration of Wu Wei. This experience was my anchor. But the fear of letting go never vanishes completely. It is a daily practice. The ego, the old controller, still pipes up, especially when uncertainty looms. The temptation to grab the oars and start paddling frantically is always there. But now, I have the memory of what happens when I trust the current. Surrender is not an act of weakness. It is an act of profound strength and trust in an intelligence far greater than my own limited mind. And a beautiful side effect began to emerge. By no longer being so consumed with paddling and planning, I started to notice things I had always missed. I started to see the subtle ways the river was guiding me, the patterns in the ripples, the direction of the wind. I was learning to read a new and more mysterious language, the language of the universe itself. Learning to surrender was like learning to breathe after a lifetime of holding my breath. By finally dropping the oars of my frantic effort, I didn't stop moving. I simply began to flow with a current that had been there all along. A quietness descended upon my inner world. The desperate, chattering need to plan, control, and predict was replaced by a state of open, watchful curiosity. It was like I had been in a loud, crowded room my whole life, and someone had finally turned off the noise. And in that newfound silence, for the first time, I began to hear the whispers. I began to learn the subtle, poetic language the universe uses to communicate with us when we are finally quiet enough to listen. I had learned about the concept of synchronicity from my audiobooks on Jungian psychology. It was defined as a meaningful coincidence and a causal connecting principle in the universe. But to read about it is one thing, to experience it is another entirely. As I moved through my days with a new sense of presence and non-resistance, these synchronicities began to happen with an almost startling frequency. They felt like private jokes between me and the cosmos. A little winks of reassurance and guidance that were tailored just for me. It began with the numbers. It was almost a cliché. The gateway drug of cosmic communication. I would glance at my phone, and it would be 11. I'd wake up in the night, and the clock would read 3:33. I'd get a receipt at a coffee shop, and the total would be $4. At first, I dismissed it as my brain's pattern recognition software working overtime. But its persistence became uncanny, almost playful. An audiobook I was listening to offered a gentle interpretation, suggesting these numbers were like little digital hellos from a higher intelligence. A way of saying, "We're here. You're on the right track. Pay attention." The language became more personal, more lyrical. I would be wrestling with a specific doubt, a wave of the old fear creeping back in, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by abandoning my old life. I'd get in my car, my heart heavy with uncertainty, and the moment I turned the key, a song would blast from the radio, a song from my teenage years that had been my personal anthem of courage, a song I hadn't heard in over a decade. The lyrics would speak with surgical precision to the exact fear I was feeling, offering the exact encouragement I needed. It felt like a direct, immediate response, a hand reaching out in the dark to give mine a reassuring squeeze. I would sit in a cafe, pondering a difficult question in my journal, and a sentence from the loud conversation at the table next to me would float over, a sentence that was the perfect, elegant answer to my unasked question, leaving me stunned and breathless. The most profound lesson in this new language came when I was standing at a major crossroads. The purge had cleared my life of all its old structures, and now I had a choice to make. It was a choice between two paths. One was a safe, practical option to get back into a similar career field, and the other was a wild, creative project that my heart was calling to, but which offered no security and no guarantee of success. My rational mind was paralyzed. It made endless pro and con lists, ran financial projections, and spiraled in an agony of indecision. My mind wanted certainty, but there was none to be had. It was during this period of intense indecision that the hawk began to appear. The first time, it was unmistakably real. I was staring out my window, lost in anxious thought, when a large hawk landed on a branch of the tree outside, not 20 feet away. It was a rare sight in my urban neighborhood. It turned its head, and its piercing, golden eyes seemed to lock onto mine for a long moment before it launched back into the sky. The encounter felt significant, numinous. A few days later, I was driving on the highway, and a large truck passed me. On its side was a stunning, photorealistic painting of a hawk in flight. Then, I was idly flipping through a magazine at a doctor's office, and I turned a page to a full-spread advertisement for a watch, featuring a stoic-looking man with a hawk perched on his gloved fist. The message was becoming insistent, but I had no idea how to interpret it. It was a symbol without a key. The key arrived, as it so often did, through my headphones. I was listening to a new audiobook, this one on mythology and animal symbolism in different cultures. I was only half listening until the narrator began a chapter on birds of prey. The hawk, his voice explained, is a messenger from the spirit world. It represents vision, clarity, and perspective. Because it flies so high, it can see the entire landscape, the bigger picture that we, on the ground, cannot perceive. When the hawk appears in your life, he continued, it is an encouragement to rise above your current situation, to untangle yourself from the messy, earthbound details and fears, and to trust your higher vision. It is a sign to connect with your soul's purpose and to fly. Every word landed like a thunderclap of clarity. The message was not a command. It was not telling me what to choose. It was telling me how to choose. It was telling me to stop listening to the fearful, detail-obsessed chattering of my ground-level mind and to trust the soaring, expansive vision of my heart. The hawk was a symbol of the very perspective I was being asked to embody. Of course, my inner skeptic the last vestige of my old self, tried to argue back. This is just confirmation bias. It reasoned, you're thinking about hawks, so now you're noticing them everywhere. But I knew the difference. The audiobook I was listening to explained it perfectly. Confirmation bias is a flat, intellectual exercise of collecting data to prove a pre-existing belief. Synchronicity is an experience of the soul. It has a texture, a feeling. It's the shiver down your spine, the sudden intake of breath, the feeling of being seen and understood by something vast and mysterious. It's the universe communicating not in the literal prose of a textbook, but in the resonant poetry of a symbol. I began to realize that for years, I had been trying to get the universe to speak my language, the language of logic, of data, of linear plans. But the universe doesn't speak prose, it speaks in symbols, archetypes, and feelings. To understand this language, my analytical mind was the wrong tool. It could see the hawk and categorize it, but it couldn't feel the meaning. It could hear the song on the radio, but it couldn't receive the encouragement. Understanding this new language required a different kind of faculty, a different kind of intelligence. It required me to shift my center of perception from the head, with its logic and its fear, to a place of deeper knowing, a place that understands through feeling, resonance, and intuition. I was learning to listen not with my ears, but with my heart. Learning to read the synchronicities of the outer world was only half of the equation. I had discovered that the universe speaks in a language of symbols and poetry. But I soon realized that to truly understand it, I needed a translator. My mind, for all its power, was the wrong tool for the job. The rational mind is a master of the finite, a brilliant navigator of the known world. It can analyze, categorize, and build logical arguments that are flawless in their construction. But when faced with the infinite, the mysterious, the symbolic, it short-circuits. Faced with a major life decision, my mind would become a courtroom drama of warring attorneys, arguing both sides of the case with equal fervor until the jury was left in a state of exhausted paralysis. Logic could lead me to a sensible answer, but it could not lead me to the right one. The path forward required a different kind of compass, a different mode of perception entirely. I had to learn to shift my center of gravity from my head to my heart. My continued journey through the world of audiobooks led me to a fascinating intersection of modern science and ancient mysticism. I discovered the work of researchers who were studying the heart not just as a pump, but as a center of intelligence. I listened, is spellbound, to narrators explaining that the heart contains a complex network of neurons, a heart-brain, and that it sends far more information and signals to the cranial brain than the brain sends to it. The heart generates a powerful electromagnetic field that changes based on our emotions and can be measured several feet away from the body. This wasn't just poetry, it was physiology. The idea that my heart was a sentient, intelligent organ with its own perceptual abilities was a paradigm-shattering revelation. It provided a scientific foothold for the ancient spiritual teaching to trust your heart. But how, practically, does one listen to their heart? It doesn't speak in words. Its language is more primal, more direct. Its language is feeling. I learned that the body is the antenna for the heart's intelligence, and the signal it sends is often referred to as a gut feeling or an intuitive hit. I began to practice tuning into this signal. Before making small decisions, I would pause, take a deep breath, and ask my body a question. I would notice the subtle, physical response. When a choice was in alignment with my deeper truth, there would be a feeling of expansion in my chest, a sense of lightness, openness, and peace. When a choice was out of alignment, the response was one of contraction, a knot in my stomach, a tightness in my throat, a feeling of heaviness and dread. My body was a flawless, instantaneous truth detector, a compass whose needle always pointed toward my own personal true north. The real test, however, came when the quiet wisdom of the heart came into direct conflict with the loud, compelling logic of the mind. The ego, the dethroned king, saw the heart's rising influence as a direct threat to its dominion and fought back with all its might. This internal battle came to a head when, out of the blue, I received a fantastic job offer after months of uncertainty following my layoff. This felt like a miracle. On paper, it was a perfect solution. It was a senior position at a stable, respected company. The salary was more than generous. The benefits were excellent, and the role utilized my old skill set perfectly. It was a lifeline, a return to security and prestige. My mind was ecstatic. It constructed a dozen airtight arguments for why I had to accept. This is the answer. It celebrated. We're saved. It would be insane, ungrateful, and utterly irresponsible to refuse this. This is the sensible path. And my mind was right. It was the sensible path. Every friend or family member I hypothetically consulted in my head would have told me to take it in a heartbeat. But when I sat down, closed my eyes, and presented the opportunity to my heart, the response was unequivocal. A cold, heavy dread pooled in my stomach. My chest felt tight, constricted, as if I were being slowly suffocated. There was no joy, no excitement, no resonance. My body was screaming no with every cell. The inner conflict was agonizing. My mind, the voice of fear and societal expectation, yelled, "Think of the money, the security. You're being a fool." My heart responded not with an argument, but with a persistent, undeniable feeling of profound wrongness. I was standing on a cliff edge, with the safe, well-lit, logical path on one side, and a dark, terrifying leap of faith into the unknown on the other. This was the ultimate test. Was I going to trust the external validation of the world, or the invisible, internal validation of my own soul? After days of turmoil, I made a choice that felt like madness to my rational mind. I trusted the feeling. With a trembling hand, I called the hiring manager and turned down the job. I mumbled some polite excuse, my own ears barely believing the words I was saying. The moment I hung up the phone, a wave of sheer terror washed over me. The ego screamed, "What have you done?" I felt like I had just thrown my only parachute out of a crashing plane. But beneath the terror, something else arose. It was a feeling of profound, inexplicable peace. The heavy, constricting sensation in my chest was gone, replaced by a vast, scary, but utterly clean emptiness. I had honored my own truth, perhaps for the first time in my life. For the next few weeks, I lived in that emptiness, a period that tested my faith in that decision every single day. The egos I told you so's were loud and frequent, but I held on to the memory of that feeling of rightness. And then, a new opportunity appeared. Not from where I expected it, but from a casual conversation with an acquaintance from my pottery class. It wasn't a job offer. It was an idea, a chance to collaborate on a small, creative project. The very kind of project my heart had been quietly yearning for. It offered little security and a fraction of the potential income of the corporate job. On paper, it was a ridiculous choice. But when I checked in with my heart, the feeling was one of pure, joyful, exhilarating expansion. It was a hell yes. It felt like coming home. That experience taught me everything. My heart intelligence has saved me. It had protected me from taking a sensible path that would have been a gilded cage, a detour away from my true purpose. It had held a space of trust long enough for the aligned opportunity to appear. In the aftermath, I was filled with a sense of awe and a powerful, new emotion. It was more than just relief. It was a deep, soul-level thankfulness. I was grateful for the guidance, grateful for the protection, grateful for the mysterious and loving intelligence of the universe that spoke not from the heavens, but from the quiet, insistent beating of my own heart. This feeling wasn't just a fleeting emotion, it felt like a state of being. A new way of seeing the world through a lens of profound appreciation. I was standing at the doorway of the next great phase of the journey. The powerful and transformative alchemy of gratitude. The experience of trusting my heart and seeing the universe conspire to support that trust left me in a new and unfamiliar state. The gnawing anxiety that had been the background radiation of my life was replaced by a quiet, humming sense of awe. This feeling was gratitude, but not the polite, superficial kind I had known before. It wasn't the dutiful thank you for a gift received. It was a deep, cellular appreciation for the very fabric of my journey, for the intelligence that had guided me through the darkness, even when I felt most lost. This feeling was the doorway, and my audiobooks were the key to understanding the profound, transformative power that lay on the other side. I was about to learn that gratitude was not just a pleasant emotion, it was an act of alchemy. I had always treated gratitude as a chore, a kind of spiritual tax I paid by mentally listing a few things I was thankful for before falling asleep. At other times, I had used it as a transactional tool, a way to be a good spiritual student so the universe would give me more things from my wish list. An audiobook I found, with a title like The Energetic Signature of Appreciation, completely shattered these misconceptions. The narrator explained that gratitude is not an action or a word. It is a frequency. It is a state of being. The universe, he proposed, does not operate on a system of merit or reward. It operates on the simple, impersonal law of resonance, like attracts like, a state of lack, of focusing on what is missing, of worry and complaint, emits a low, contracted, chaotic frequency. A state of genuine gratitude emits a high, expansive, coherent frequency. To practice gratitude, then, was not to politely ask for more. It was to retune my own energetic signature to become a vibrational match for abundance, joy, and grace, thereby drawing those experiences to me effortlessly. This understanding shifted the practice from a duty to a form of powerful, personal science. Guided by a new audiobook, I began the simple, foundational ritual of a gratitude journal. The instruction was specific. Every night before bed, write down 3 to 5 things from the day for which I was genuinely grateful. And crucially, to write down why. At first, it felt awkward and forced. My mind, so expertly trained to scan for problems, threats, and deficiencies, struggled with the new task. My first entries were generic and detached. I'm grateful for my home. I'm grateful for my health. I'm grateful for food. It felt like doing homework. The audiobook pushed me to go deeper, to find the specific, sensory details. So, my home became the deep comfort of my favorite armchair and the way it supports my back perfectly. My health became the energetic feeling in my legs as I walked up the hill today, and the simple magic of my lungs filling with cool, clean air. Food became the burst of sweet, tangy flavor from the orange I ate this afternoon, and the vibrant color of the peel. This specificity was the key. It forced me out of my head and into the present moment. It compelled me to notice my life, to pay attention to the small, constant stream of goodness that I had previously taken for granted. Slowly, day by day, the alchemy began to work. The practice started to physically retrain my brain. I learned from another narrator about the reticular activating system, a part of the brainstem that acts as a filter for information. By consciously focusing on things to be grateful for, I was reprogramming this filter, instead of constantly scanning my environment for threats, problems, and what was wrong. My mind began to actively search for beauty, for kindness, for things to appreciate. The world itself didn't change, but my perception of it was undergoing a revolution. I would find myself stopping on the sidewalk to marvel at the intricate, fractal pattern of a fern. I would feel a wave of genuine appreciation for the bus driver who waited an extra second for me to get on. My morning cup of coffee, once a mindless caffeine delivery system, became a rich, multi-sensory experience to be savored. My reality was being transformed not by acquiring more, but by appreciating more. The most potent and challenging phase of this practice was learning to be grateful for the hardships. This, my audiobook guide explained, was the true mark of the alchemist, the ability to turn the lead of past pain into the gold of wisdom. At first, the idea seemed absurd, even offensive. Be grateful for losing my job. Be grateful for the loneliness. Be grateful for the terrifying uncertainty. But I was encouraged to reframe it, to look for the gift hidden within the wound. I sat with my journal and tried. I am grateful for losing my high-paying job, I wrote, hesitatingly, because it liberated me from a path that was suffocating my soul and forced me to discover what truly brings me joy. The feeling shifted. I am grateful for that period of intense loneliness, because it taught me how to be my own best friend and to find wholeness within myself. I could feel the bitter resentment in my heart beginning to dissolve, replaced by a sense of profound respect for my own journey. I was no longer a victim of my past, I was a student of it. This practice didn't erase the pain, but it integrated it, honoring it as a necessary and valuable part of my own becoming. This new state of being began to infuse my daily routines. My daily walk, once just a way to get exercise, became a sacred ritual. I would put on an audiobook of meditative music or a guided gratitude track, and I would dedicate the walk to the practice. Each step became a silent thank you. Thank you for the solid ground beneath my feet. Thank you for the strength in my legs. Thank you for the sound of children laughing in a nearby park. Thank you for the feeling of the wind on my skin. The mundane act of walking was transformed into a powerful, moving prayer that steeped my entire being in the frequency of appreciation. The world I inhabited now felt fundamentally different. It felt benevolent, supportive, and alive with a quiet magic. I understood that my experience of reality was not an objective report, but a reflection of my inner state. By cultivating gratitude, I had changed my inner state, and in doing so, had changed the entire world. This constant appreciation for the simple, present moments, the taste of water when I was thirsty, the comfort of a warm blanket, the intricate beauty of a spider's web was blurring the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary. I was beginning to suspect that the sacred I had been searching for wasn't hidden away in some future state of enlightenment. It was right here, right now, concealed in plain sight within the humble, overlooked details of the everyday. The practice of gratitude was like turning on a light in a dark room. The practice of presence was learning to see what the light revealed. For so long, my concept of a spiritual life had been wrapped in a kind of romanticism. I believed it was something separate from my ordinary existence, something to be pursued through grand gestures and esoteric practices. It was the hour-long meditation on a special cushion, the weekend retreat in the mountains, the dramatic emotional catharsis, the quest for a mind-bending mystical vision. My life was the boring prose of reality, and I was seeking the beautiful poetry of a spiritual peak experience. I was constantly looking for the sacred somewhere else in the future, on a mountaintop, in the next book, the next workshop. The great, humbling, and profoundly liberating revelation of this next phase was that I had been looking in the wrong direction entirely. The sacred was not somewhere else. It was right here, hiding in plain sight, disguised as my own boring, mundane life. My guide into this new territory was Zen. I stumbled upon audiobooks by modern Zen masters and ancient poets, and their message was radically, refreshingly simple. They spoke of a spirituality that was grounded, earthy, and immediate. The core teaching, which I heard in various forms, was revolutionary to my striving mind. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The outer circumstances of life do not necessarily change. The chores remain. The daily tasks persist. What changes is the consciousness you bring to them. Enlightenment was not a destination you arrived at, but a state of presence you inhabited, moment by moment. Therefore, any activity, no matter how mundane, if performed with total, undivided attention, could become a gateway to the sacred. This idea felt both liberating and deeply challenging. It meant there was no escape. I couldn't put off my spiritual practice until I had more time or a quieter house. My practice was now. In this very moment. It was in the way I made my bed, the way I brushed my teeth, the way I responded to an email. The universe wasn't asking for grandiose, heroic acts of devotion. It was asking for my presence. So I decided to conduct a simple experiment. Inspired by a Zen story I had heard in an audiobook. The experiment was to drink a single cup of tea. This was an action I performed every day. But I did it with a complete absence of mind. I would drink my tea while scrolling through my phone, while lost in anxious thoughts about the future, while listening to the news. The tea was just a prop, a bit of background scenery in the chaotic movie playing in my head. This time, I decided, would be different. I would give the tea my full, undivided attention. I turned off my phone. I sat at my small kitchen table with no other distractions. I began the process. And for the first time, I truly paid attention. I watched the steam rise from the kettle. A dancing, ephemeral cloud. I listened to the sound of the hot water pouring over the tea leaves in the cup. A gentle, rushing sound. I held the ceramic mug in both hands and just felt its warmth. Letting it seep into my palms, I noticed the color of the tea. A rich, amber liquid. And the way the light played upon its surface. I lifted the cup and inhaled its aroma. A deep, earthy fragrance that I had never truly appreciated before. Then, I took the first sip. Instead of gulping it down, I let the liquid rest in my mouth for a moment. Feeling its heat and its complex flavor, a delicate balance of bitterness and a subtle, floral sweetness. In those few minutes, a profound shift occurred, as my attention became fully absorbed in the sensory experience of the tea. The incessant chatter of my mind, for the first time without effort, went quiet. The barrier between me, the drinker, and the tea, the object, began to dissolve. There was only the unified, singular experience of warmth, of taste, of presence. That simple, 5-minute act of drinking tea delivered more peace, more stillness, and more of a feeling of sacred connection than any of the hours I had previously spent on a meditation cushion, wrestling with my own distracted mind. It wasn't a peak experience. It was a peace experience. It was the direct, embodied understanding that holiness is not found in the extraordinary. It is found by bringing an extraordinary quality of attention to the ordinary. This small act became my model. I started applying this principle of mindful presence to other mundane chores. Washing the dishes, once a task to be rushed through with resentment, became a water meditation. I would focus on the feeling of the warm, soapy water on my hands, the satisfying scrape of the sponge against the plate, the shimmering beauty of the bubbles. It became a simple, grounding ritual of creating order and cleanliness. My daily walks evolved again. They were no longer about gratitude or exercise, but about the pure act of walking. I would feel the sensation of my foot making contact with the pavement, the subtle shift of weight, the rhythm of my own body moving through space. I became aware of the world around me with a new clarity, the way the wind moved the leaves on a tree, the specific shade of blue in the sky, the intricate pattern of a crack in the sidewalk. I came to realize that my spiritual practice was not a segment of my day. My spiritual practice was my life. Every moment was the cushion. Every task was the meditation. Every interaction was the lesson. This realization was the final nail in the coffin of the separation between my spiritual life and my regular life. It was all one thing. It was all sacred. Or none of it was. The choice was simply in where I placed my attention. This profound shift toward embodied presence had another, deeper consequence. By focusing so intently on the sensory world, the feeling of warmth, the taste of food, the sensation of my feet on the ground, I was inhabiting my body in a way I never had before. For most of my life, I had lived from the neck up. A mind that treated my body as a vehicle to be fueled, maintained, and occasionally disciplined. Now, I was experiencing reality through my body. I was no longer a ghost in the machine. I was the living, breathing, feeling consciousness of the machine itself. And I was beginning to suspect that this body, this vessel I had so long ignored, had its own form of intelligence, its own secrets, and its own wisdom to share. The sacred was not only in the world around me, it was in the very cells of my being. Finding the sacred in the mundane act of drinking tea or washing dishes had retethered me to the physical world. But more importantly, it had retethered me to my own body. For most of my life, I had operated as a disembodied intellect, a mind that drove a machine. My body was a utility, an instrument to be maintained, disciplined, and when it malfunctioned, to be silenced. Pain was an enemy, a signal to be eradicated with a pill. Tension was a nuisance, a byproduct of a productive life to be ignored until it became debilitating. Sickness was an infuriating inconvenience. My body and I were not on speaking terms. Our relationship was one of a frustrated master to a faulty and unpredictable servant. The new state of presence I was cultivating began to change that. I was no longer just a mind that happened to have a body. I was an integrated consciousness experiencing reality through a body. And I was about to discover that this vessel was not a dumb machine. It was a living archive, a wise counselor, a sacred oracle. My audiobook explorations led me down a new path, one that bridged the gap between spirituality and physiology. I discovered the revolutionary work of physicians and psychologists who were compassionately mapping the mind-body connection. Through my headphones, I listened to these calm, authoritative voices explain a concept that resonated with a terrifying and immediate truth. The body keeps the score. They explained that trauma, both big T traumas and the smaller, subtler relational hurts, is not just a mental or emotional event. It is a physiological one. When emotions are too overwhelming to be processed, when we are forced to suppress our authentic responses to survive, that energy doesn't just vanish. It gets trapped. It lodges itself in our nervous system, in our fascia, in our muscle tissue. It becomes the chronic tension in our shoulders, the inexplicable knot in our stomach, the persistent ache in our lower back. My body, I realized, was a living history book of every unwept tear, every swallowed scream, every moment I had to be strong when I wanted to crumble. This new paradigm completely reframed my understanding of physical symptoms. An ache or an illness was not a random malfunction. It was a message. It was a sophisticated, intelligent communication from the deepest parts of myself, from the subconscious that had no other way to get my attention. My body, I learned, was speaking to me in the only language it knew, the language of sensation. My job was not to silence the message, but to learn how to translate it. This lesson became intensely personal through my long and frustrating relationship with chronic lower back pain. It had been my unwelcome companion for over a decade. I'd seen doctors who x-rayed me and found nothing structurally wrong. I'd seen chiropractors who offered fleeting relief. The consensus was always mechanical and external. You sit too much. Your core is weak. It's just the stress of modern life. I had accepted my pain as a frustrating but inevitable part of my existence. It was a problem to be managed, never a message to be understood. One afternoon, I was listening to an audiobook on this very topic. The narrator, a doctor with a gentle voice, asked a series of questions that pierced through my years of conditioning. Instead of asking why you have this pain, he suggested, try asking the pain itself what it is trying to tell you. What is its emotional quality? Is it hot, sharp, dull, heavy? If this sensation could speak, what would it say? What burden has your back been carrying for you, so your conscious mind wouldn't have to? This was a radical idea, to treat my pain not as an antagonist, but as an intelligent messenger. That evening, I decided to try it. Instead of taking a painkiller, I lay down on the floor, closed my eyes, and did something I had never done before. I deliberately sent my attention into the pain. I stopped resisting it. I breathed into it, surrounding the sensation with a curious and compassionate awareness. I asked the question, silently, what are you holding for me? What is the story you are telling? At first, there was only the familiar, dull ache. But as I stayed with it, as I simply listened with my entire being, something began to shift. A wave of a long-forgotten emotion washed over me, a feeling of immense, crushing responsibility. And then, a memory fragment, not as a clear image, but as a distinct emotional echo, surfaced from the depths. It was the feeling of being a small child in my childhood home, feeling the heavy, unspoken tension between my parents, and feeling, with a child's magical thinking, that it was my job to hold everything together, to be the good, strong, stable one, so that nothing would fall apart. It was the feeling of bracing myself, of holding a weight far too heavy for my small frame. In a flash of sickening, soul-level recognition, I understood. My back pain wasn't a muscular issue. It was the physical manifestation of a lifelong pattern of carrying emotional burdens that were not mine to carry. My back was literally buckling under a weight I had put there 40 years ago. The intellectual insight was immediately followed by a powerful emotional release. Tears I didn't know I had stored began to flow, tears for that small boy who felt so unsupported and so responsible. As the grief moved through me, I felt a distinct, undeniable shift in the physical sensation in my back. The pain didn't vanish, but its character changed. The hard, angry knot softened. The electrical charge dissipated. It was as if the story, having finally been heard, no longer needed to scream so loudly. I realized that healing my back was not about doing more crunches. It was about learning to put down the weight, to heal the wound of the unsupported child within me. This experience opened up a whole new world of embodied practices. I found audiobooks that guided me through gentle somatic movements, teaching me how to communicate with my body through movement to release trapped energy. I discovered breathwork, using the power of my own breath to stir up and clear out stagnant emotions. My yoga practice transformed from a workout into a conversation, a daily opportunity to listen to what my body needed instead of forcing it into what my mind wanted. My body became my most trusted advisor, my unerring oracle. Before making a decision, I would check in. Does this choice make my body feel expansive and light, or contracted and heavy? When a wave of anxiety hit, I learned to stop and ask, what is my body trying to warn me about? What boundary is being crossed? It was a far more reliable compass than my overthinking mind. By learning to listen to the wisdom of my own flesh and bone, I had finally, truly come home to myself, and this new, compassionate relationship with my own being naturally began to overflow, changing the very way I perceived and interacted with everyone else around me. Learning to inhabit my body and listen to its wisdom was a homecoming, a return to the forgotten landscape of my own being. This newfound intimacy with myself, this deep and compassionate understanding of my own stored pain and my own truth, inevitably began to radiate outwards. It became a new lens through which I viewed the world. And most profoundly, it changed the way I perceived every relationship in my life. I had once seen the world of people as a collection of allies, adversaries, and neutral parties. My relationships were largely transactional, based on what I could get, how people made me feel, and who was to blame when I felt bad. Now, I was beginning to understand that no relationship is an accident. Everyone who crosses your path, especially those who press your buttons the most, is a sacred assignment. The world is not a random collection of people. It is a meticulously designed spiritual gymnasium, and relationships are the equipment designed for your soul's specific workout. My audiobook guides shifted from the internal world of the body to the interpersonal world of connection. They introduced a framework that was both liberating and radically accountability-driven. The core principle was this: every interaction is a mirror. The qualities in others that infuriate, irritate, or enchant you are reflections of your own inner landscape. The difficult person in your life is not your tormentor. They are your most dedicated teacher, a messenger showing you precisely where you are not yet free. This meant I had to completely abandon the comfortable, ego-gratifying role of the victim. I had to stop asking, "Why is this person treating me this way?" and start asking the far more challenging question: "What is this person's behavior activating within me? What unhealed wound, what disowned part of myself is being triggered by this interaction?" This shift from blame to responsibility was the key that unlocked an entirely new way of relating to others. The most potent arena for this practice was, of course, my family. I had a long-standing, painful dynamic with a close family member. Our interactions were a predictable, soul-draining dance. They would lead with criticism or passive aggression, and I would respond with defensiveness and resentment. We would play out the same tired script every time we spoke, both of us leaving the conversation feeling unseen, unheard, and angry. My story was simple: this person was difficult, and I was their unfortunate victim. An audiobook, Unconscious Relationships, offered a staggering reframe. The narrator spoke of soul contracts, the idea that we agree, on a soul level before we are born, to help each other learn specific lessons. The most difficult people in our lives are often our closest soulmates. Brave volunteers who have taken on an unlikable role to hold up a mirror to our deepest wounds. The critical parent arrives to teach you the art of self-validation. The needy sibling appears to teach you the power of healthy boundaries. The betraying friend comes to teach you the necessity of self-reliance and forgiveness. Suddenly, I saw this family member in a completely new light. I looked past their difficult behavior and, for the first time, I saw the pain that must be driving it. Their constant criticism of me was perhaps a projection of their own savage inner critic. Their need to control was likely rooted in a deep fear of their own life being out of control. My resentment began to soften, replaced by an unfamiliar and tender wave of compassion. This new perception allowed me to change my steps in our painful dance. I understood I couldn't change them, but I could change my response. The next time we spoke and the inevitable criticism came, I didn't take the bait. The old me would have launched into a detailed, defensive argument. The new me took a deep breath, connected with the feeling of self-worth in my own chest, and said calmly, "I hear that you see it that way. Thank you for sharing your perspective." I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I simply honored my own reality without needing them to validate it. The first time I did this, there was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. The old script had been discarded, and they didn't have new lines. Our dynamic didn't transform overnight, but the toxic, energetic charge began to dissipate. By refusing to play my victim role, I was giving them, and myself, the opportunity to create a new, healthier way of relating. This led me to the second pillar of conscious relationships: boundaries. I had always thought of boundaries as aggressive walls I built to keep people out. The audiobooks taught me that healthy boundaries are not walls, they are fences. Lovingly erected, they are a quiet, firm declaration of what is and is not okay for you. They are an act of radical self-respect. And paradoxically, they are also an act of love for the other person, because they replace unspoken resentment with honest clarity. I learned to say no without guilt, understanding that a resentful yes serves no one. Finally, this work led me to the ultimate spiritual assignment: forgiveness. For years, I had been holding onto grudges, replaying old hurts in my mind, believing that my anger was a weapon I was wielding against those who had wronged me. A wise narrator on one of my audiobooks used an analogy that shattered this illusion. Holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I realized forgiveness was not a gift I gave to the other person. It was not about condoning their behavior or saying that what they did was okay. Forgiveness was a gift I gave to myself. It was the act of drinking the antidote. It was the conscious decision to sever the energetic cord that bound me to the pain of the past, to stop allowing an old wound to define my present reality. It was a declaration of my own freedom. As I practiced these principles, taking responsibility, setting loving boundaries, and offering forgiveness, I saw my relationships transform. But the most profound transformation was not in how others treated me, it was in how I treated myself. Every boundary I set with someone else was reinforcing my own self-worth. Every time I chose compassion over judgment for another, I was healing my own inner critic. Every act of forgiveness towards another was an act of forgiveness for my own past mistakes. All the messy, complicated, and beautiful work of healing my relationships with the outer world was, in the end, a reflection of the one relationship that mattered most. It was all pointing back inward, to the deepening connection with my own soul. And I began to feel a new longing, not for the company of others, but for the pleasure of my own. I was ready to truly get to know the person I was becoming, to take myself on a date, and to fall in love. The profound work of healing my relationships with others had led me to the inescapable truth that every external relationship was a mirror of my internal one. I had learned to offer others compassion, to set loving boundaries, and to forgive their imperfections. Now, it was time to turn that same compassionate, respectful, and forgiving gaze fully upon myself. For years, I had been searching for wholeness in the arms and approval of others, hoping someone else would come along and make me feel complete. I now understood that this was an impossible task. The only person who could give me the love I so desperately craved was me. This realization sparked a new desire, not for connection with another, but for a deep and intentional intimacy with myself. I was about to embark on the most important romance of my life. I was going to learn how to date myself. First, I had to confront my deep-seated fear of being alone. Like most people in our hyper-connected world, I had unconsciously used noise, busyness, and the constant presence of others as a shield against the vast, intimidating silence of my own company. An empty evening was a problem to be solved with a dinner plan, a television show, or mindless scrolling. The thought of spending a weekend with no plans and no one to see was a source of anxiety, not excitement. It felt like loneliness. My next audiobook guide, a philosopher who spoke with the clarity of a mountain stream, helped me dismantle this fear by making a crucial distinction. Loneliness, he explained, is a state of lack. It is a painful, hungry feeling that arises when you are focused on the absence of another. Solitude, on the other hand, is a state of rich and joyful presence. It is the pleasure of your own company. Loneliness is wanting someone to fill your emptiness. Solitude is the celebration of your own fullness. My new task was to learn the art of transforming loneliness into solitude, I decided to approach this practically, using the metaphor of courtship. If I wanted to fall in love with my own soul, I had to woo it. I had to show myself the same care, attention, and reverence I would show a beloved partner. I began by scheduling a non-negotiable date night with myself once a week. The first time, it felt absurd, but I committed to the ritual. I cleaned my apartment not as a chore, but as an act of creating a beautiful space for my date. I lit a candle. I put on a playlist of music that I truly loved. Not music I thought was cool or that an old partner enjoyed. I cooked myself a delicious, nourishing meal, taking my time, savoring the process, instead of just grabbing something quick and convenient. And I sat and ate my meal without the glow of a screen for company. Instead, I listened to an audiobook of poetry, letting the beautiful language wash over me. In these simple, intentional acts, I began to rediscover myself. I realized how many of my tastes and preferences had been shaped by a desire to fit in or please others. Did I actually enjoy crowded concerts? Or did I go because I thought I should? Did I prefer action movies? Or was that just a compromise? I started taking myself on other dates to art museums I'd always meant to visit, to quiet cafes with a journal, to long walks in the park without a destination. I was learning my own rhythms, my own authentic likes and dislikes. I was learning to listen to myself. The ultimate test of this newfound self-reliance was the decision to take a solo trip. It was a terrifying prospect. The idea of traveling alone, eating alone, being a single, solitary unit in a world of pairs and groups, triggered all my fears of being seen as lonely or pathetic. "You're going alone?" a well-meaning friend asked, their voice laced with pity. But I knew this was a pilgrimage I had to make. It wasn't a big, elaborate vacation. It was a simple, 3-day trip to a small coastal town a few hours away. My only planned companions were a carefully curated selection of audiobooks, a beloved novel from my past that felt like an old friend, a collection of essays on nature and simplicity, and a biography of a fiercely independent artist I admired. These were not distractions, they were my chosen company. Voices that would spark wonder and contemplation, not demand anything from me. The first 24 hours were a trial by fire. The silence in the hotel room felt deafening. The habit of reaching for my phone to check for messages was a constant, physical itch. I went to a small restaurant for dinner and felt 100 pairs of eyes on my table for one. Even though no one was looking, the loneliness I had feared felt crushingly real. I was face to face with my own profound discomfort in my own skin. The shift happened on the second day. I forced myself to leave the room and walk on the beach, putting on the audiobook about the artist's life, as her story of courage and creative integrity filled my ears, and the sound of the waves crashed on the shore. Something inside me settled. I was not a pathetic, lonely man on a beach. I was a man in solitude, communing with the ocean and a great mind. I spent the afternoon in a local bookstore, taking hours to browse. With no one rushing me, I sat at a cafe, sipping coffee and writing in my journal for 2 uninterrupted hours. I discovered a profound and exhilarating freedom. I was the sole author of my own time. There were no negotiations, no compromises, no one else's needs or moods to consider. The feeling was not one of loneliness, but of sovereignty. I discovered a well of contentment and self-reliance within me that I never knew existed. And in the fertile silence of that solitude, I began to hear it. It was a voice I had heard before, but had always been too distracted to pay attention to. It was not the anxious chatter of the ego or the calculating logic of the mind. It was a quieter, deeper current. It was the voice of intuition, the whisper of my own soul. It didn't speak in full sentences, but in flashes of insight, in sudden creative ideas, in a quiet, gut-level knowing. It was the voice that pointed me toward my passions, That reminded me of my forgotten dreams. I realized that solitude was the price of admission for hearing this voice. The soul does not shout. It will not compete with the noise of the world. It waits for us to become quiet enough to hear its subtle, loving guidance. By the time I drove home from that trip, I was a different person. I had gone seeking to escape loneliness and had, instead, fallen in love with solitude. I had fallen in love with the person I was when no one else was watching. This new love was not a quiet, contained feeling. It was an active, generative energy. It was an overflowing of the heart that created a powerful, undeniable urge, the desire to express what I was finding within. Just as a lover wants to write poems and sing songs, my soul, now in love with itself, wanted to create. The rich, quiet ground of solitude had been the perfect soil for the seeds of creativity to finally, joyfully, begin to sprout. The act of falling in love with my own solitude had created a rich, fertile inner landscape. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of a quiet, joyful presence. This newfound wellspring of self-love began to overflow. And this overflow created a natural, powerful, and at first, deeply intimidating urge, the desire to create. For most of my life, I had operated under the limiting belief that I was not a creative person. I was an analyst, a strategist, a thinker. Creativity was a magical, mysterious talent bestowed upon a chosen few, the painters, the poets, the musicians. It was something I appreciated from a distance. Like a beautiful, exotic bird I could admire but never touch. My old identity was so wrapped up in being logical and practical that I had disowned my own innate human impulse to make, to express, to bring something new into the world. My next audiobook guide arrived as if on cue. A teacher who specialized in unblocking this very channel. It was a book that felt like a compassionate but firm hand, guiding me back to a part of myself I had long ago abandoned. The narrator's central message was a revelation. Creativity is not a rare talent. It is our natural state. It is the signature of our soul. The same life force that pushes a flower up through the concrete and spins galaxies into being. It is not limited to the high arts. It is present in the way you arrange flowers in a vase, the way you find a novel solution to a problem at work, the way you cook a meal with love, the way you tell a story to a child. The universe is endlessly creative. And as a part of the universe, that same creative energy is our birthright. The problem is not that we lack creativity. It is that we have buried it under layers of fear, self-doubt, and the harsh judgment of our inner critic. The book proposed a core practice, a deceptively simple tool designed to circumvent the critic and clear the channel. It was a practice called morning pages. The instructions were to get a simple notebook and, every single morning, immediately upon waking, before doing anything else, to write 3 pages of longhand, stream of consciousness prose. There were no rules about content. It could be a jumble of anxieties, a grocery list, a rant about the weather, a half-remembered dream. The point was not to create good writing. The point was simply to get the pen moving and keep it moving, to open the tap and let whatever was in the pipes flow out, unfiltered and unjudged. My logical mind resisted. This is a waste of time. It scoffed. You have nothing important to say. The first few weeks were a painful slog. My pages were filled with whining, with boring to-do lists, with self-conscious ramblings about how pointless the exercise felt. The inner critic was having a field day, perched on my shoulder and mocking every sentence I wrote. But I had learned to trust the process. So I persisted. I treated it like a morning chore, a form of psychic dental hygiene. Then one morning, about a month into the practice, something shifted. I sat down with my notebook, and as I started to write, the usual resistance was gone. The words began to flow with an ease and speed that felt unfamiliar. My hand was moving across the page, but my conscious mind was not directing it. I wasn't thinking about what to write next. I was simply a witness to the words as they appeared. I wrote about a forgotten childhood memory with a clarity and sensory detail that stunned me. An idea for the creative project I had been contemplating suddenly unfurled itself with perfect, élégant logique. I lost all track of time when I finally lifted my pen after filling 3 pages. I felt a sense of exhilaration and deep, peaceful joy. I had, for the first time, entered a flow state. This was the great secret of the practice. The magic wasn't in the finished product, the messy, handwritten pages I was instructed not to even reread for weeks. The magic was in the process. It was the feeling of being in that state of flow. A state where the ego, with its fears and judgments, steps aside, and a greater, more intuitive intelligence takes over. I realized that in those moments, I was not the one creating. The small, anxious self I identified as me had become a conduit, a channel for a stream of creativity that came from somewhere else, from a source far larger and wiser than my own limited intellect. This is why it felt so sacred. It was a direct, tangible experience of co-creation with the universe. The daily ritual of the morning pages became my anchor. It was a non-negotiable act of showing up for my own soul. It was in that quiet, pre-dawn hour that I untangled my anxieties, received flashes of inspiration, and, most importantly, cultivated a relationship with that state of creative flow. This new connection began to spill out into other areas of my life. I felt a new sense of playfulness and permission. I bought a cheap set of watercolors and spent a whole afternoon just exploring how the colors blended on the page. With no goal of creating a recognizable painting, I began to experiment in the kitchen, seeing cooking not as a chore, but as a delicious form of alchemy. I was learning to separate the joyful act of creation from the ego's demand for a perfect, impressive product. This fundamentally changed my understanding of what it means to be an artist or a creator. It is not about talent or external validation. It is about the willingness to be a channel. It is about the courage to get your own ego out of the way so that the universal life force can express itself through you in its own unique and unpredictable way. As I leaned into this, I began to sense a profound connection. The same creative intelligence that was flowing through my pen as I wrote my morning pages was the same intelligence that was unfurling the fern on my windowsill and orchestrating the complex migration of birds. My personal act of creation was a fractal of a universal, cosmic creativity. I was not a solitary artist in my room. I was a participant in an infinite, interconnected web of creation. I was a note in a symphony that encompassed all of existence. My journey into creativity had opened a channel within me, allowing a force larger than my small self to flow through. The joy of being in that flow state, of being a vessel for an intelligence that was not my own, sparked a profound and life-altering question. If this universal creative energy can flow through me, where else does it flow? Is the impulse that moves my pen the same impulse that pushes a seed through the soil? Is the intelligence that solves a plot point in my writing the same intelligence that designs a spiral galaxy? For the first time, I began to truly question the most fundamental illusion of my human experience, the illusion that I am separate from everything else. I had spent my entire life feeling like me in here, a fragile, isolated consciousness looking out at the world out there. I was about to understand that this feeling of separation was the root of all my fear, and that its dissolution was the key to true peace. My audiobook library became my university for the study of oneness. I was drawn to the great mystics and philosophers of the East. Through my headphones, I would hear the timeless wisdom of the Upanishads, explaining that Atman, the individual soul, and Brahman, the ultimate reality of the universe, are one and the same. I listened to Buddhist teachers speak of interbeing, the concept that nothing can exist by itself alone, that a sheet of paper contains the cloud, the sunshine, the logger, and the logger's parents. It cannot be by itself. It must be with everything else. These were not just beautiful philosophical ideas. They resonated with the truth I had felt in my moments of creative flow. Then, I was guided back to the strange world of quantum physics, but with new ears to hear its implications. I listened to narrators explain the mind-bending reality of quantum entanglement, which Einstein called spooky action at a distance, how two particles, once connected, can remain instantaneously linked across vast distances, each one responding to the state of the other. They spoke of the origins of the universe, how everything that exists, every star, every planet, every living being was once condensed into a single, infinitesimal point. This meant that on a fundamental level, we are not just connected, we are all made of the exact same primordial stardust. The separation we experience is a convincing, but ultimately superficial, sensory illusion. I even found audiobooks on indigenous wisdom, which shared a perspective that felt ancient and deeply true. The concept of all my relations, it was a worldview that didn't place humans at the top of a pyramid, but as one humble part of a vast, interconnected family that included the stone people, the river people, and the tree people. This intellectual understanding was the kindling, but the fire was lit during an experience in nature. I had gone for a hike deep in a forest, seeking the solitude that had become so nourishing to me. I was listening to an audiobook about the interconnectedness of ecosystems. The narrator describing the wood wide web, the vast underground network of fungal mycelium that connects the trees, allowing them to share nutrients and information. He spoke of how the oxygen I was breathing was a gift from these trees, and the carbon dioxide I was exhaling was a gift back to them. The whole forest was a single, breathing organism. I found a spot at the base of a huge, ancient oak tree and sat down, leaning my back against its rough, solid bark. I closed my eyes, feeling the sun on my face, listening to the narrator's voice and the sound of the wind in the leaves above. And then, something happened. It wasn't a thought or an idea. It was a dissolution. The clear, hard line of my physical body, the boundary between me and the tree, began to feel porous and then vanished entirely. The feeling of the rough bark against my back became indistinguishable from the feeling of my own spine. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves felt as if it were happening inside my own head. The cool, damp scent of the earth was not something I was smelling. It was a part of my own being. The I that was a man with a name, a history, and a list of problems simply evaporated. In its place was a vast, silent, and blissfully peaceful awareness. This awareness was the tree, and the sunlight, and the feeling of the roots deep in the earth, and the sound of the wind. There was no separation. There was no me to experience the forest. There was only the forest experiencing itself. It was a moment of pure, undiluted oneness. It may have only lasted for a few minutes, but it irrevocably rewired my entire perception of reality. You cannot have an experience like that and go back to seeing the world in the same way. The illusion of the separate self, once seen through, can never be fully believed in again. The practical consequences of this shift were immediate and profound. My relationships with other people transformed. When I looked at a stranger now, I no longer saw an other. I saw a different expression of the very same consciousness that animated me. I saw myself in a different costume. The impatience I used to feel with a slow cashier, the judgment I had for a person with different political views, the irritation I felt in traffic, all of it began to seem absurd. How can you be angry with yourself? How can you judge yourself? A deep, effortless, and unconditional compassion began to arise, not as a moral principle to be practiced, but as the natural byproduct of my new perception. My relationship with the planet also changed. It was no longer an abstract political issue. It was personal. The news of a polluted river felt like a sickness in my own veins. The sight of a forest being clear-cut felt like an assault on my own lungs. The understanding that I was not living on the earth, but that I was the earth, created a deep and urgent sense of stewardship and love for the totality of my larger body. I did not remain in that state of blissful unity forever. The ego, the sense of being a separate person, I did eventually return. It is the operating system for navigating the human world. After all, but its power was gone. It was no longer the absolute monarch. It was a temporary role I was playing. I now knew, with a certainty that transcended belief, that my true nature was not the small, separate self, but the vast, interconnected consciousness in which the entire universe is unfolding. This realization had one final, powerful consequence. It completely dismantled my concepts of lack and abundance. If my true self is the entire universe, how can I possibly be lacking anything? The universe is not something out there that I need to beg for resources. I am the universe. Its infinite creativity, its boundless energy, its endless intelligence are my own inherent qualities. The very idea of scarcity, which had driven so much of my fear and ambition, was revealed to be a laughable illusion based on a mistaken identity. I was not a small wave, terrified of being crashed upon the shore. I was the entire, magnificent ocean. And this deep, cellular knowing of my own infinite nature was about to completely redefine my understanding of what it means to be prosperous. The direct, visceral experience of oneness was the ultimate antidote to the poison of lack. To feel, even for a moment, that my own consciousness was inseparable from the consciousness of the entire universe, was to understand that my very essence was abundance. If I am everything, then what could I possibly be without? This profound philosophical realization was beautiful and deeply peaceful. But a part of my mind, the practical part, still conditioned by years of living in the material world, immediately posed the question, how does this feeling of cosmic unity pay the rent? How does being one with a star help me with my bills? I was about to discover that this spiritual insight was not an escape from the practicalities of money, but a direct pathway to transforming my entire relationship with it. For my entire adult life, my relationship with money had been a source of chronic, low-grade anxiety. It was my primary measure of success and security, and therefore, of my own self-worth. My bank balance was a fluctuating grade on my life's report card. When it was high, I felt a fleeting sense of safety and pride. When it was low, I felt the familiar, cold grip of fear and failure. I believed, as I had been taught, that money was a scarce resource, something to be pursued, fought for, and hoarded. It was something out there that I had to work hard and sacrifice my happiness to obtain. Money was not a tool, it was a tyrant. My audiobook library, which had been my guide through psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, now became my financial advisor. But of a radically new kind. I found books on the abundance mindset and conscious wealth. Their narrators spoke of money in a way I had never heard before. They proposed that money is not a thing, it is energy. Like all energy, it is not inherently good or evil. It is neutral, and it responds to the frequency we hold. It is simply a symbol of value exchanged, a current that must flow. To cling to it in fear, they explained, is to build a dam and stop the flow. To spend it with guilt is to pollute the river. To use it with joy, trust, and a sense of purpose is to invite the current to flow more strongly and freely through your life. These guides encouraged me to become a detective of my own limiting beliefs. I was prompted to sit down and excavate the subconscious programming I had received around wealth. I unearthed dusty, inherited beliefs from my family and culture. Money doesn't grow on trees. You have to work hard for your money. Wanting more is greedy. You can't be both spiritual and rich. I saw how these beliefs had been the invisible operating system running my financial life, creating a reality of struggle and scarcity, regardless of how much I was actually earning. The work was to consciously uproot these beliefs and plant new ones based on my recent experiences. The universe is infinitely abundant. My worth is inherent and has nothing to do with my net worth. Money can be a beautiful tool for good. It is safe for me to be both spiritually aligned and financially prosperous. This inner work led to the most important realization of all. My definition of abundance had been painfully narrow. I had been chasing one form of wealth, financial capital, at the expense of all others. Now, having been stripped of my old career, I was forced to take a new kind of inventory. I realized, with a jolt of astonishment, that I was, in that very moment, wealthier than I had ever been in my life. I had an abundance of time, the freedom to structure my own days, to wake without an alarm, to read a book on a Tuesday afternoon. This was a luxury my old salary could never buy. I had an abundance of health and vital energy, no longer being drained by chronic stress. I had an abundance of authentic relationships, connections based on truth rather than convenience. I had an abundance of creative ideas, which now flowed to me constantly in my state of quiet presence. I was rich in all the currencies that truly mattered, the currencies that actually create a joyful and meaningful life. This new, expanded definition of wealth completely changed my approach to my work. My old model was to trade my life force for money, working a job I didn't love because the financial reward was high. I was constantly chasing the money. Now, my focus shifted. I poured my energy into the new, creative project that my heart had guided me toward. My primary intention was not to make money, but to create value, to express my authentic self, and to find joy in the process itself. I focused on the giving, not the getting, and a strange magic began to happen. Because I was operating from a place of genuine passion and alignment, the work I produced had a new energy, a quality that people were naturally drawn to. Opportunities began to appear, not because I was desperately networking and hunting them down, but because my joyful, valuable work was acting as a magnetic beacon. Money began to flow, often from unexpected sources. A small project would lead to a larger one. An acquaintance would recommend me to a client. The money that came in felt different. It didn't feel like a reward for suffering. It felt like a natural, graceful byproduct of my joyful self-expression. It was the universe's thank you for the value I was adding to the whole. My emotional state around money was transformed. I learned to receive it with deep gratitude, seeing it as an affirmation of my alignment. I learned to spend and invest it consciously, without fear, using it as a tool to support my well-being and to further the work I loved. Money was no longer my master. It had become a trusted partner, a supportive form of energy that flowed through me. Not just to me, this shift from chasing to attracting revealed the final piece of the puzzle. True, sustainable prosperity doesn't come from a desperate focus on what you can get. It comes from a joyful focus on what you can give. The more I aligned with my unique purpose and offered my gifts to the interconnected web I now knew I was a part of, the more the universe, in its flawless, reciprocal logic, supported me. My desire was no longer to simply be rich. It was to be a clear and open channel for abundance to flow through me and out into the world. My focus had turned, completely and irrevocably, toward the idea of service. The understanding that I was an inseparable part of a universally abundant whole was the final key. It unlocked me from the prison of getting. My life's focus, for the first time, pivoted 180 degrees. The fundamental question that drove me was no longer, what can I get from the world to make myself feel secure and happy? The experience of oneness had answered that. I already had everything, because I was everything. A new, more resonant question now arose from the fullness of my own being. What is my unique gift to give to the world? The desperate, anxious energy of acquisition was replaced by a calm, joyful, and powerful impulse to contribute. I was entering the chapter of my life defined by service. Like every other stage of this journey, my first understanding of service was filtered through the lens of my ego. I imagined it as something grand and visible. My mind, still eager to create a new spiritual identity, to begin to construct heroic narratives. Perhaps my purpose was to write a best-selling book that would change millions of lives. Maybe I was meant to be a world-renowned teacher, speaking on stage to sold-out auditoriums. Or maybe I should start a major nonprofit organization. These ideas, while noble on the surface, felt heavy. They were tainted with the ego's need for recognition and importance. They were about being seen as a person of service. Rather than simply being of service, the quiet wisdom of my heart remained silent on these grandiose plans. My listening journey guided me, as always, to a more subtle and profound understanding. I discovered audiobooks on finding one's purpose, including one that beautifully explained the Japanese concept of ikigai. A narrator with a warm, encouraging voice explained that your ikigai, or reason for being, is not some hidden treasure you must heroically discover. It is found at the simple, elegant intersection of four circles: what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what you can be valued for. The framework was a map that pointed not to a destination out there, but to the center of my own life, to the skills and passions that were already present. The book prompted me with a series of simple questions. What do you do that makes you lose track of time? What qualities do people consistently praise in you? What problem in the world breaks your heart? As I sat with these questions, I began to review my life, not through a lens of accomplishment, but through a lens of natural expression. I set aside the fantasies of being a famous author or speaker and just looked at the simple reality of my recent interactions. I noticed a quiet, consistent pattern. In conversations, people seemed to relax around me. Friends who hadn't called in months would reach out to talk through a complex problem. Even casual acquaintances would find themselves opening up to me about their lives. The common denominator was that people felt safe, seen, and heard in my presence. The realization dawned on me not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, gentle sunrise. My great, unique gift, the one I was meant to give to the world, was not something I needed to go out and acquire. I already had it. It had been cultivated through every stage of my difficult journey. It was the simple, sacred, and profoundly needed gift of deep listening. The work I had done to quiet my own mind now allowed me to truly hear another. The work I had done to face my own shadow now allowed me to sit with another's darkness without judgment. The compassion I had learned for myself now flowed naturally toward others. My purpose wasn't to be a great speaker, but to be a great listener. My service wasn't to fix anyone, but to create a safe, loving space where they could begin to heal themselves. This understanding was humbling and deeply liberating. I didn't need to quit my life and move to a monastery. I didn't need a grand platform. My field of service was my everyday life. I began to practice this gift with conscious intention. When my friend called in a panic, I put down what I was doing, took a deep breath, and gave them the full, undivided attention of my quieted mind. I listened not just to their words, but to the emotions beneath the words. I didn't offer advice unless asked. I simply offered the gift of my presence. In meetings for my own creative projects, I made a point of noticing who was the quietest person in the room and creating an opening for their voice to be heard. I began to see every conversation as an opportunity for this quiet form of service. And in this giving, I discovered the purest joy I had ever known. It was a joy that had nothing to do with personal gain. It was the joy of seeing the tension in a friend's shoulders release as they felt truly understood. It was the joy of witnessing another person have their own aha moment of clarity, simply because I had held a space of non-judgmental attention for them. It was the deep, resonant satisfaction of knowing I was contributing to the world, not from a place of ego, but from the most authentic and compassionate part of myself. It was the joy of circulation, of allowing the love and wisdom that had been poured into me to flow back out into the world. I realized that service is not a specific job title. It is the intention you bring to every action. When I worked on my creative project, my service was to pour my most authentic truth into it, in the hope that it might resonate with and help someone else. When I interacted with a cashier at the grocery store, my service was to offer them a moment of genuine eye contact and a warm smile, acknowledging our shared humanity. When I felt frustrated by a setback, my service was to meet that moment with patience and grace, refusing to add more negative energy to the world. My entire life was becoming an act of service, a continuous offering of the best of what I had become. There was no longer a distinction between my spiritual practice and my daily life. My way of being in the world was my practice. My life was my message. I was no longer a man striving to become spiritual. I was a spiritual being, finally and fully living a human life. This was the essence of integration. The path of my awakening was not a straight line leading to a sunlit peak. It was a spiral, circling ever deeper into the center of my own being. Looking back from this new vantage point, I can see the distinct turns of the journey, the naive excitement of my first forays into manifestation, the terrifying darkness of the purge and the long night of the soul, the gritty and uncomfortable work of facing my own shadow, the liberating free fall of surrender, the quiet joy of finding my purpose in service. Each stage was essential. Each painful lesson was a necessary initiation. And now, I have arrived at a place not of perfection, but of integration, a place of wholeness. Let me be clear. As this is the most important part of my confession, this journey does not end with a happily ever after. This is not a fairy tale. The spiritual path did not lead me to a magical kingdom where the sun is always shining and nothing bad ever happens. That is the greatest lie the spiritual marketplace tries to sell. Life, in all its messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful glory, still happens. The world still contains suffering. I still have days filled with frustration. I still have moments of doubt. I still feel anger and sadness. The storms still come. The difference is that now, I am no longer a small, terrified boat being tossed about by the waves. I have become the lighthouse. I have found a place of unshakable stillness within myself that can witness the storm without becoming it. Just last week, a creative project I had poured my heart into hit a major, unexpected snag. The old me, the pre-awakening me, would have spiraled into a vortex of despair. I would have seen it as a sign of my own failure, proof that I was an imposter. The voice of the ego would have run rampant, creating stories of catastrophe and ruin. I would have blamed my collaborators. I would have blamed the universe. And most of all, I would have blamed myself, likely abandoning the project entirely in a fit of self-pity. My response, this time, was different. Did I feel a sharp sting of disappointment? Yes. Absolutely. Did a wave of anxiety about the future wash over me? For a moment, it did. But here's what changed. I had the awareness to observe it. I could feel the disappointment in my chest without letting it define my entire reality. I could hear the anxious thoughts without believing they were the absolute truth. I paused. I took a few deep breaths, feeling my feet on the floor, grounding myself in the present moment. I offered compassion to the part of me that was feeling hurt and scared. I didn't try to suppress the feeling or slap a positive affirmation on top of it. I allowed it to be there, like a passing weather system. And because I didn't resist it, because I met it with awareness instead of fear, it moved through me much more quickly. The pain was there, but the suffering, the dramatic story of failure that my ego used to attach to the pain, was absent. I was able to look at the problem with clarity. And within a day, I saw a new, more creative solution that wouldn't have been possible without the initial setback. This is integration. It is not the absence of problems, it is a new capacity to dance with them. I was listening to an audiobook recently about Japanese aesthetics, and I discovered the art of kintsugi. It is the practice of repairing broken pottery, not by hiding the cracks, but by mending them with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy behind it is that the object is more beautiful, more unique, and more valuable because it has been broken. The cracks are not flaws to be disguised. They are a celebrated part of the object's history, a testament to its resilience. As I listened to the narrator describe this, tears streamed down my face. I saw myself. I am a kintsugi bowl. The cracks are the loss of my job, the painful end of friendships, the terrifying dark night of my soul, the shame of facing my own shadow, and the shimmering gold is the awareness, the self-love, the compassion, and the wisdom that I use to mend those breaks. I am not healed back to good as new. I am more beautiful for having been broken. The not pretty parts of my awakening are the very lines of gold that give my life its character, its strength, and its depth. This has freed me from the tyranny of perfection. For so long, I was trying to become a perfect person, and then a perfectly spiritual person. It was an exhausting, impossible standard. Now, I have no interest in perfection. My only interest is in wholeness. And wholeness, by its very nature, includes everything. It includes my light and my shadow, my confidence and my vulnerability, my joy and my capacity for sorrow. I can be a deeply spiritual person who also gets grumpy when I'm hungry. I can be a compassionate listener who also needs a day of complete solitude. I am no longer striving to be a marble statue, flawless and cold. I am content to be a human being, messy, paradoxical, and real. My authenticity is my new bottom line. And so, the very idea of a spiritual practice has dissolved. It is no longer a separate activity I must do. My life is my practice. My work is my meditation. My relationships are my yoga. The act of creating is my prayer. The act of listening is my service. The boundary between the sacred and the mundane has vanished because I have finally understood that it was never there to begin with. The audiobooks that were once my desperate lifelines in a stormy sea are now my delightful companions. I listen not to fix a problem or to find an urgent answer, but out of a spirit of joyful, endless curiosity. The journey is not over. Awakening is not a destination at which you arrive. It is the way you walk the path, the quality of presence you bring to each step. I am not a finished product. I am a work in progress. A kintsugi soul, continually being broken and remade, each time with a little more gold. And it is, in its own raw and authentic way, profoundly beautiful. Of course, here is the conclusion in detail. And so, my confession comes to a close. We have journeyed together, from the first hairline crack in the facade of a life that looked perfect but felt hollow, through the seductive, empty promises of superficial manifestation. We walked into the darkness of the purge, where everything I thought I wanted was stripped away. And we sat in the profound, disorienting silence of the ego's death. We listened to the whispers of the shadow. We learned the terrifying art of surrender. And we found a quiet, unshakable truth in the heart of our own being. This path was not the beautiful, sun-drenched ascent I was promised by the gurus of positivity. It was a messy, painful, and often ugly demolition of a false self. And I can tell you now, with a certainty that resonates in my very bones, that this difficult path was the only way home, the ultimate truth of this journey. The core message I feel compelled to share is this: spiritual awakening is not an escape from the messiness of life. It is the courage to dive into that mess with your eyes and heart wide open. It is not about levitating above your problems. but about rooting yourself so deeply in your own truth that you become unshakable. Even as the storms of life rage around you, peace, I have learned, is not the absence of the storm. It is the stillness of the soul in the very center of it. The books and the whispers that guided me. The voices from my audiobooks that were my lifeline in the dark. They did not contain the answers. They were simply the keys. They were the prompts, the questions, and the catalysts that helped me unlock the doors to the wisdom that was already and always waiting inside me. And it is waiting inside you, too, if you are listening to this now. Perhaps it is because you have felt that same crack in your own reality. Perhaps you are walking through your own dark night, feeling lost, broken, and wondering if you have made a terrible mistake. Hear me when I say this. You are not doing it wrong. The pain, the confusion, the shedding of the old self, this is not a sign that you are lost. It is a sign that you are finally finding your way. Do not be afraid of the parts of your journey that are not pretty. That is where your power is buried. That is where the gold is hidden. You are not broken. You are breaking through. After all, the books have been listened to. After all, the teachers have had their say. The final and most important guide you will ever have is the quiet, insistent voice of your own soul. Learn to trust it. Learn to honor it. It is the only voice that matters. Your life is your sacred text. You are your own guru. Now, begin.